In the shadowed halls of Styles Court, where memories of murder linger, an ailing Hercule Poirot returns for his final stand. A chilling note warns of a watcher in the dark, a mastermind who weaves death without touching a blade. Who is this unseen puppeteer? Why does fear grip the guests? As Poirot's sharp mind battles his failing body, one question burns. Can he unmask evil before it claims another soul? Chapter 1. The return to Styles. The wheels of the hired car crunched over the gravel drive, stirring a faint cloud of dust that hung in the late summer air like a reluctant ghost. Captain Arthur Hastings, his face creased with the weight of years, and worry, peered through the window at the looming silhouette of Styles Court. The old manor, once a symbol of genteel elegance, now sagged under the burden of time. Its ivy-clad walls, chipped, its windows dulled by neglect. He adjusted his spectacles, a nervous habit. Cand glanced at the figure beside him, swathed in blankets, despite the August warmth. Hercule Poirot, the great detective, was a shadow of his former self. His once meticulous mustache drooped its ends, no longer waxed to perfection, and his frame, confined to a wheelchair, seemed to shrink into the cushions. Yet his eyes, those piercing green orbs, gleamed with undimmed acuity, scanning the approaching house as if it were a chessboard mid-game. Hastings felt a pang of unease. Poirot had summoned him with an urgent letter, cryptic in its brevity. Come to Styles, mon ami. Time is short, and evil stirs. No explanation, no pleasantries, just a command that Hastings, loyal as ever, could not ignore. Styles, Hastings murmured, breaking the silence. It's been, what, 30 years? Feels like a lifetime. Poirot's lips twitched, a ghost of his old smile. Sighing, 2 years, Hastings, to be precise. The little gray cells, they do not forget. This place, it holds memories, does it not? Our first case together, murder, deception, and the triumph of order over chaos. Hastings nodded, his mind drifting to 1916. When they had unraveled the poisoning of Emily Inglethorpe in this very house. But the nostalgia soured as the car slowed. Why here, Poirot? Why now? You're not well, old friend. This journey is necessary. Poirot interjected, his voice sharp despite its frailty. You will understand soon, Hastings. There is a purpose, a grave one. But for now, observe. The eyes, the ears, they must be open. The car halted before the entrance, where a young woman in a maid's uniform waited, her hands twisting nervously at her apron. She was slight, with auburn hair pinned haphazardly and eyes that darted like a cornered doe's. As Hastings stepped out to assist with Poirot's wheelchair, she hurried forward, her voice trembling. Mr. Poirot, sir, I'm Mary. Mrs. Luttrell sent me to welcome you. The other guests, they're in the drawing room, Bateau. Sir, it's good you're here. Something's not right. Her words tumbled out, unpolished but earnest. Poirot's gaze fixed on her, unblinking. Right, mademoiselle. Explain, if you please. Mary hesitated, glancing at the house as if it might overhear. It's just feelings, sir. His eyes watching, whispers in the halls. I know it sounds daft, but I swear someone's up to no good. Last night, I found a candle left burning in the library, and no one owns to it. Mrs. Luttrell says I'm imagining things, but enough. Mary, came a sharp voice. A woman in her 50s, stern-faced with iron-gray hair, merged from the doorway. Mrs. Luttrell, the current mistress of Styles, carried herself with the air of one who brooked no nonsense. You'll not trouble our guests with your fancies. Help with the luggage, and be quick. Mary flushed, bobbing a curtsy before scurrying to the car. Hastings frowned, sensing her fear was genuine, but Mrs. Luttrell's presence stifled further inquiry. She turned to Poirot, her expression softening only slightly. Mr. Poirot, Captain Hastings, welcome. The house is full. I'm afraid, guest. from London and beyond. Dinner's at 7. I trust you'll find your rooms comfortable. Most kind, Madame Poirot replied, his tone polite but probing. And these guests? They are interesting, perhaps. Mrs. Luttrell's lips thinned. Interesting enough. She'll meet them soon. Come, let's get you settled. Inside, Styles Court was a faded echo of its past. The grand staircase creaked underfoot, and the air smelled of damp wood and wax polish. Hastings pushed Poirot's wheelchair through the hall, noting the portraits that hung askew, their subjects staring down with disapproval. The drawing room buzzed with voices as they approached, and Hastings braced himself for the crowd. The guests were a motley assembly, gathered around a tarnished silver tea service. Colonel Toby Luttrell, Mrs. Luttrell's husband, stood by the fireplace, his red face flushed from brandy or temper. He was a barrel-chested man, his military bluster barely contained by his tweed suit. Beside him, Dr. John Franklin, a lean scientist with a hawkish nose, spoke in low tones to Judith Hastings, Hastings' own daughter. Judith, at 25, had her father's earnest eyes, but a sharpness all her own. Her auburn hair swept into a modern bob. Hastings felt a twinge of pride and uneasings her presence here. Across the room, Miss Cole, a nervous nurse with darting eyes, fussed over a tray of biscuits, while Mr. Boyd Carrington, a wealthy scholar with a penchant for rare books, leafed through a volume with exaggerated care. A young couple, the Allertons, lounged near the window, their laughter brittle as if masking some private strain. And in the corner, almost unnoticed, sat Stephen Norton, quiet man with wire-rimmed glasses, his mild demeanor at odds with the room's tension. Father. Judith broke away from Franklin, crossing to kiss Hastings' cheek. I didn't know you'd be here, Kay. Mr. Poirot, it's been ages. Her smile faltered as she took in Poirot's frailty, but she recovered quickly. What brings you to this dreary place? It's business, my dear, Poirot said, his voice warm but guarded. And you? Why are you here? Judith shrugged, glancing at Franklin. A holiday of sorts. Dr. Franklin's working on some research, and I'm assisting. Styles seemed a quiet spot. Quiet. Colonel Luttrell barked, overhearing. This place is a damned circus. Too many people, too much chatter, and that maid Mary, is it? Always skulking about, muttering nonsense. Nonsense. Poirot's tone was mild, but his eyes sharpened. Perhaps, Colonel, you have noticed these disturbances she speaks of. Luttrell snorted. Girls got an imagination bigger than my regiment. Candles, shadows rubbish, though I'll grant the place feels off. Always has, since the war. Mrs. Luttrell intervened, her voice cutting. Toby, don't bore our guests. Mr. Poirot, you'll want to rest before dinner. Mary will show you to your rooms. But Poirot lingered, his gaze sweeping the room. Hastings followed his eyes, noting how they paused on Norton, who sat quietly, his fingers tracing the rim of his teacup. Something in that stillness unnerved Hastings, though he couldn't say why. In their shared, sweeter, cramped pair of rooms overlooking the overgrown garden, Hastings helped Poirot settle. The detective's hands trembled as he adjusted his blankets, but his voice was steady. Hastings, you must be my eyes and ears. I am not what I was, but the mind, it remains. There is evil here, mon ami. Not the evil of a single act, but a shadow that moves among us, unseen. Evil. Hastings frowned, lowering his voice. You mean a crime? Poirot, you're not suggesting murder. Not yet, Poirot said, his words chilling, but the potential, it is here. You saw the maid, Mary. Her fear is real. And the guest's each carries a secret, a motive, perhaps. We must watch, listen, and above all, understand. Hastings paced, his mind racing. But who? The Colonel's a loud mouth, but harmless. Franklin's a bit intense, but he's a scientist, not a killer. And Judith, she's my daughter, Poirot. Surely you don't suspect. I suspect everyone, Poirot said softly. Even those we love. Trust no one until we know more. A knock interrupted them. Mary stood at the door, her face pale. Mr. Poirot, sir, I shouldn't be here, but found something in the library after the candle business. She held out a crumpled scrap of paper, her hands shaking. It was tucked in a book, like someone hid it. Poirot took the paper, unfolding it with care. Scrawled in a hurried hand were the words, "Beware the one who watches." They know? No signature, no context, just a warning that sent a shiver through. Hastings. Who wrote this, mademoiselle? Poirot asked, his voice gentle but insistent. I don't know, sir, Mary whispered, but I feel it's someone's watching, always. I thought you'd know what to do. Poirot studied her, then nodded. You were right to come to me. Say nothing of this, Mary. Return to your duties, and fear not. Hercule Poirot is here. She left, casting a nervous glance over her shoulder. Hastings stared at the note, his heart pounding. What does it mean, Poirot? Who's watching? Poirot folded the paper, tucking it into his waistcoat. Mon ami is the question. Someone in this house plays a game of shadows, and we are but pieces on their board. Tonight, at dinner, we began to unravel the truth. As Hastings helped Poirot prepare for dinner, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across Styles Court. The air grew heavy, as if the house itself held its breath. In the dining room below, the guests gathered, their voices, a mix of forced cheer and unspoken tension. Poirot's eyes gleamed with purpose, and Hastings knew, with a mix of dread and excitement, that the great detective's final battle had begun. Chapter 2. Shadows of Suspicion. The dining room at Styles Court was a cavern of faded grandeur. Its long mahogany table gleaming under the flicker of a tarnished chandelier. The air was thick with the scent of roasted pheasant and the undercurrent of unease that seemed to cling to the walls like damp moss. Hercule Poirot sat at the head of the table, his wheelchair a stark contrast to the high-backed chairs occupied by the eclectic gathering of guests. His sharp eyes, undimmed by age, darted from face to face, cataloging every gesture, every fleeting glance. Captain Arthur Hastings, seated to his right, felt the weight of Poirot's scrutiny even as he tried to focus on the meal before him. The guests were a peculiar mix, each a distinct thread in a tapestry of suspicion Poirot was already weaving. There was Colonel Roderick Spence, a barrel-chested man with a voice like gravel, whose anecdotes about his military days in India were as loud as they were frequent. Across from him sat Nurse Evelyn Carter, her thin lips pressed into a perpetual frown, her fingers nervously twisting the napkin in her lap. Dr. Leonard Franklin, scientist with a disarming smile and eyes that lingered too long, leaned toward Judith Hastings, Arthur's daughter, who laughed too brightly at his murmured remarks. Then there was Mr. Percival Gray, reclusive scholar whose wire-rimmed spectacles and ink-stained fingers suggested a life spent buried in books, though his silence at the table was almost palpable. Rounding out the group was Mrs. Clara Winthrop, the widowed owner of Styles, her elegance frayed by years of solitude, her sharp wit cutting through the conversation like a well-honed blade. The meal had begun cordially enough, with Mrs. Winthrop presiding over the table like a queen over a fractured court. But as the soup course gave way to the main, the conversation took a jagged turn. Colonel Spence, his face flushed from a second glass of claret, slammed his fist on the table, rattling the silverware. I'll not hear another word about this blasted war nonsense, he bellowed, glaring at Dr. Franklin. Your theories about science solving all the world's problems. Rubbish. It's men with backbone who win wars, not test tubes. Franklin's smile didn't waver, though his eyes glinted with something colder. "My dear Colonel, backbone is splendid, but it's the mind that shapes the future. Imagine a world where we could say, eliminate weakness, entirely disease, frailty, even moral cowardice." Judith laughed, a nervous trill that made Hastings' stomach twist. "Oh, Leonard, you sound like you're plotting to play God." "Perhaps I am," Franklin replied, his tone light but his gaze heavy, fixed on Judith in a way that made Hastings grip his fork a little tighter. Poirot's voice, soft yet piercing, cut through the tension. "Monsieur Franklin, you speak of eliminating weakness. Oh, what of those who exploit the weaknesses of others? Is that not a greater danger?" The table fell silent. Franklin's smile faltered for a fraction of a second before he recovered. "An interesting point, Monsieur Poirot. But surely you, of all people, know that the mind can be swayed to act in ways it might not otherwise." A Poirot's mustache twitched, a subtle sign of his amusement, perhaps his suspicion. "Persuasion, oui. But there is a difference, n'est-ce pas, between persuasion and manipulation." Hastings watched as the guests exchanged glances, some wary, others puzzled. Nurse Carter's napkin was now a crumpled knot in her hands, and Mr. Gray's fork hovered midway to his mouth, as if frozen by Poirot's words. Mrs. Winthrop, however, leaned forward, her eyes gleaming with interest. "Manipulation, Monsieur Poirot?" she said, her voice smooth as velvet. "Are you suggesting someone here is pulling strings?" Poirot's smile was enigmatic, a sage, only that human nature is a complex dance. One must watch the steps carefully to see who leads and who follows. The conversation shifted uneasily to lighter topics, Mrs. Winthrop's rose garden, the weather, but Hastings couldn't shake the feeling that Poirot's words had cast a shadow over the room. He glanced at Judith, who was now whispering with Franklin, her face flushed with excitement. Hastings' heart sank. His daughter, always so headstrong, seemed drawn to the scientist's charisma like a moth to a flame. He made a mental note to speak with her later, though he dreaded the inevitable argument, as the dessert course poached pears in a delicate syrup was served. Nurse Carter excused herself, her face pale. "I'm feeling a touch unwell," she murmured, her voice barely audible. She rose, swaying slightly, and Mr. Gray, ever the gentleman, stood to assist her. "Let me help you to your room," he offered, his voice low and earnest. No, she said quickly, almost sharply. "I'll manage. It's just a bit of air." Perhaps she hurried from the room, leaving a ripple of concern in her wake. Mrs. Winthrop frowned. "Poor Evelyn. She's been out of sorts since she arrived. I do hope it's nothing serious." Colonel Spence snorted. "Oops, that's all women like her always make a fuss over nothing." Judith's eyes flashed. "That's unfair, Colonel. She's been working tirelessly, caring for invalids. It's exhausting work." "Exhausting or not," Spence retorted, "she ought to keep her wits about her. This place is enough to give anyone the jitters, what with all the creaking floors and ghosts of the past." Hastings glanced at Poirot, expecting a quip about superstition, but his friend was silent, his fingers steepled, his gaze fixed on the empty doorway where Nurse Carter had disappeared. The meal concluded with strained pleasantries, and the guests dispersed, some to the drawing room for brandy, others to their rooms. Hastings lingered, waiting for Poirot's signal. When the dining room was empty, save for the two of them, Poirot leaned toward Hastings, his voice low. "Mon ami, did you observe the nurse's departure? The tremor in her hands, the haste in her steps?" Hastings nodded, though he wasn't sure what Poirot was driving at. "She did seem unwell. Do you think it's serious?" Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Serious, oui, but not in the way you mean. I suspect, Hastings, that Mademoiselle Carter has seen something or someone that frightens her. In fear, it is a most revealing emotion. Frightened, Hastings frowned. By whom? One of the guests. Perhaps, Poirot said, his voice a whisper. Or perhaps by something less tangible. A shadow, a whisper, a suggestion. There is one among us, Hastings, who does not kill with their own hands, but with the minds of others. It's a perfect murderer, who orchestrates death as a conductor leads a symphony. Hastings felt a chill, despite the warmth of the room. A perfect murderer. Poirot. That's monstrous. Poirot agreed. And yet, brilliant. To kill without touching the weapon, to remain unseen while others fall. This is the art of the one I seek. Before Hastings could press further, a piercing scream shattered the quiet. It came from the direction of the east wing, where Nurse Carter's room was located. Hastings leaped to his feet, his heart pounding, and Poirot's hand shot out, gripping his arm. Vide Hastings. We must go. They moved as quickly as Poirot's wheelchair allowed, Hastings pushing him down the dimly lit corridor. The other guests were already converging on the source of the scream, their faces a mix of alarm and curiosity. Colonel Spence was barking orders as if on a battlefield, while Judith clung to Franklin's arm, her eyes wide. Mrs. Winthrop, composed but pale, led the way to Nurse Carter's room. They found her slumped in an armchair by the window, her face ashen, her breathing shallow. A glass of water lay shattered on the floor, its contents pooling around her feet. Dr. Franklin knelt beside her, checking her pulse with practiced efficiency. She's fainted, he announced, his tone calm but authoritative. Likely a combination of exhaustion and nerves. Nothing to worry about. Nothing to worry about. Colonel Spence scoffed. She screamed like a banshee. Judith pushed forward, her voice trembling. We should call a doctor. What if it's something serious? Franklin's smile was reassuring, but to Hastings it seemed almost too perfect. I am a doctor, Miss Hastings. She'll be fine with rest. I'll stay with her until she comes around. Poirot, who had been silent, wheeled closer, his eyes scanning the room. Monsieur Franklin, you are most kind. But tell me, what was Mademoiselle Carter doing before she screamed? Franklin hesitated, just for a moment. I wasn't here, Monsieur Poirot. I assumed she was resting. Resting, Poirot repeated, his tone neutral, but his eyes sharp. He gestured to the broken glass. Yet, the glass is shattered, the water spilled. A curious detail, Nan. One does not drop a glass so violently while resting. Mrs. Winthrop stepped forward, her voice crisp. Perhaps she saw something outside. The window is open, and it's a dark night. Poirot's gaze flicked to the window, where the curtains swayed gently in the breeze. Perhaps, he said, but his tone suggested he thought otherwise. Has. Franklin and Judith helped Nurse Carter to her bed. Poirot beckoned Hastings aside. Mon ami observed the room. The glass, the window, the chair. They tell a story. But it is not the story the others see. Hastings looked around, tried to see what Poirot saw. The room was tidy, save for the broken glass and the spilled water. A small table held a few personal items: a comb, a handkerchief, a bottle of smelling salts. The window was indeed open, but the night beyond was still, with no sign of disturbance. What are you thinking, Poirot? Hastings whispered. Poirot's voice was barely audible. I'm thinking, Hastings, that this was no simple feint. The scream, the glass, the timing it is all too convenient. Someone wished to draw attention, or perhaps to divert it. And I suspect it is the beginning of something far more sinister. By the time Nurse Carter revived, her eyes were wide with fear. But she insisted she remembered nothing unlongly, a sudden dizziness, a sense of dread. Franklin administered a mild sedative, and the guests dispersed, murmuring about nerves and overwork. But Hastings couldn't shake Poirot's words, nor the memory of the maid's earlier fear. her whispered warning about someone evil watching as they returned to Poirot's room. The detective's voice was grave. It begins, "Hastings, the first move has been made. We must watch closely, for the next will be bolder." Hastings nodded, his mind racing. The night seemed darker now, the shadows deeper, as if Styles Court itself were holding its breath, waiting for the next act in a deadly game. Chapter 3. The puppeteer strings the morning sun draped Styles Court in a deceptive golden glow. As if trying to mask the creeping unease that clung to its weathered walls, Hercule Poirot, confined to his wheelchair, sat by the tall window. In the drawing room, his sharp eyes scanning the garden beyond. The manicured hedges and blooming roses seemed almost too perfect, cade for the undercurrents of malice he sensed among the guests. Captain Arthur Hastings, his loyal friend, stood nearby, fidgeting with his cufflinks, his unease palpable. "Mon ami," Poirot said, his voice soft but piercing. "You are as restless as a fox in a trap. What troubles you?" Hastings glanced at Poirot, his brow furrowed. "It's this place, Poirot Styles. It's like stepping into a memory, but one that's gone sour. And Judith, she's not herself. She's been spending too much time with that Dr. Franklin." Poirot's lips twitched, not quite a smile. "Dr. Franklin, oui, a man of charm, but charm is a mask, Hastings. We must see what lies beneath." His fingers tapped the armrest of his wheelchair, a rhythm that betrayed the storm of thoughts in his mind. "I have asked you to watch Mademoiselle Judith closely. She is your daughter, but even daughters can be drawn into dangerous games." Hastings nodded, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of doubt. Judith, his only child, had grown into a spirited woman of 28, with her mother's auburn hair and a stubborn streak that rivaled his own. Her fascination with Dr. John Franklin, a scientist with a silver tongue and an unsettling intensity, gnawed at Hastings' nerves. He had seen her laughing with Franklin in the garden yesterday, her eyes bright with something more than curiosity. The drawing room door creaked open, and Judith herself entered, her cheeks flushed from the morning air. She wore a simple, green dress that caught the light, but her expression was guarded. "Father, Monsieur Poirot," she said, nodding to each. "I didn't expect to find you both here so early." "Early, ma chère." Poirot's tone was light, but his gaze was a scalpel. "For an old man like me, sleep is a reluctant guest. Can you? What brings you indoors when the garden calls?" Judith hesitated, her fingers twisting a stray curl. "I was speaking with Dr. Franklin. He's working on something extraordinary, a theory about human potential. He says we could eliminate weakness, make society stronger." Poirot's eyes narrowed, though his smile remained. "A noble goal, perhaps, but strength, mademoiselle, is a dangerous word. It tempts those who seek to control others." He paused, letting the words settle. "Tell me, what does Dr. Franklin say about eliminating weakness?" Judith's flush deepened, but she held Poirot's gaze. "He believes science can identify those who hold progress back, the unfit, he calls them. He's not cruel, Monsieur Poirot. He's just logical." "Logical," Poirot echoed, his voice a whisper. "Logic, my dear Judith, can be a cold blade in the wrong hands, Sense shifted uncomfortably, sensing the weight of Poirot's words. Before he could speak, the door swung open again, admitting Colonel Luttrell, barrel-chested man with a bristling mustache and a temper to match. His wife, Daisy, trailed behind, her delicate frame overshadowed by his bluster. "Morning, all," Trawl boomed, oblivious to the tension. "Fine day for a walk, Hastings? Though I dare say this old pile's seen better days." He gestured at the peeling wallpaper, his laugh too loud for the quiet room. Daisy, hearts darting nervously, offered a timid smile. "It's still lovely, George. The history here, It's like living in a story. A story with ghosts, perhaps, Poirot murmured, his gaze flicking to Daisy. She flinched, as if he'd touched a nerve. The conversation was interrupted by a sharp cry from the hallway. Hastings was on his feet in an instant, followed by Judith, while Poirot's hands gripped his wheelchair, his frustration at his immobility evident. They hurried out, finding the young maid, Elsie, crumpled against the banister. Her face pale. "It was up there," Elsie gasped, pointing to the balcony overlooking the grand staircase. Something moved someone. "I swear I saw a shadow." Hastings steadied her, his voice gentle. "Easy, Elsie. You're safe now. It's probably just a trick of the light, okay?" Elsie's voice cracked. "It wasn't the light. Someone was watching me. I know it." Poirot, wheeled forward by Judith, studied Elsie with an intensity that made her shrink back. "Mademoiselle Elsie, describe this shadow. Was it tall? Short? Did it move quickly?" Elsie's hands trembled. "It was tall, I think. It moved. Fast, like it didn't want to be seen. Okay, up on the balcony, near Miss Allerton's room." Miss Allerton, the nervous nurse, had been notably absent from breakfast. Poirot's mind raced, cataloging details. "Merci, Elsie, you are most helpful. Hastings, perhaps you will escort Mademoiselle Elsie to the kitchen for some tea. She needs calm." As Hastings led Elsie away, Poirot turned to Judith. "Ma chère, fetch Dr. Franklin. I wish to speak with him. And you, Colonel, Madame Luttrell join U.S. in the library in 10 minutes. I have questions." Judith hesitated, then nodded, hurrying off. Trog grumbled, but followed his wife toward the library, leaving Poirot alone for a moment. He closed his eyes, his mind weaving a tapestry of suspicion. The shadow, the maid's fear, Judith's fascination with Franklinit was all connected, he was certain. But how? In the library, the air was thick with the scent of old books and wax polish. Poirot sat at the head of a long table, his wheelchair positioned like a throne. Hastings returned, followed by Dr. Franklin, whose polished demeanor seemed unshaken by the morning's disturbance. Judith lingered near the door, her eyes flicking between Franklin and Poirot. "Dr. Franklin," Poirot began, his voice deceptively mild, "you have been discussing grand theories with Mademoiselle Judith, theories of strength and weakness. Tell me, do you believe some lives are expendable?" Franklin's smile was smooth, but his eyes flickered. "Monsieur Poirot, you misunderstand. My work is about progress, not destruction. Study human behavior, genetics. We could eliminate suffering, disease, frailty." He glanced at Poirot's wheelchair, then quickly away. Poirot's expression remained unreadable. "Frailty, we, like my own, perhaps. Tell me, doctor, have you ever considered that your ideas might inspire darker actions? To eliminate, not just weakness, but people." Franklin's smile faltered. "That's absurd. I'm a scientist, not a murderer." "Yet ideas, doctor, can be weapons," Poirot said softly, "and weapons find their way into dangerous hands." Before Franklin could respond, a scream echoed from upstairs. Hastings bolted toward the sound, with Judith and Franklin close behind. Poirot, cursing his immobility, gestured to Luttrell. "Colonel, assist me." Luttrell, grumbling, pushed Poirot's wheelchair up the ramp to the first floor, where a small crowd had gathered near the balcony. Miss Allerton, the nurse, lay sprawled on the floor below, her neck twisted at an unnatural angle. Judith gasped, clutching Franklin's arm, while Hastings knelt beside the body, checking for a pulse. "She's gone," Hastings said, his voice hollow. "Must have fallen from the balcony." Poirot's eyes swept the scene, noting the splintered railing above. "A fall, you say?" His voice was sharp. "Or was she pushed?" The guests murmured, their faces a mix of shock and suspicion. Daisy Luttrell clutched her husband's arm, her eyes wide. It was an accident, surely. The railing, it's old, unsafe. Poirot's gaze locked on the balcony, then on Franklin, whose composure seemed strained. Hastings examined the railing carefully. Hastings climbed the stairs, inspecting the splintered wood. It's broken clean through, he called down, but there's something odd. The break looks fresh, but not natural, like it was cut part way. Poirot's lips pressed into a thin line. Cut, you say? Interested. And who was near the balcony this morning? Elsie saw a shadow. Miss Allerton's room is close by. Who among you was upstairs? The guests exchanged uneasy glances. Franklin spoke first, his voice steady. Hey, I was in the garden with Judith. We were nowhere near here. Judith nodded, but her eyes darted away, avoiding Poirot's gaze. Colonel Luttrell huffed. I was in my room, shaving. Daisy was with me. Poirot's fingers drummed on his armrest, and yet someone was seen. Someone tall, moving quickly. We must search Miss Allerton's room. Hastings, you and Judith go now. As they moved to comply, Poirot caught Franklin's eye. Doctor, you will stay. I have more questions. Miss Allerton's room was tidy, almost sterile, with a single suitcase and a few medical books on the nightstand. Hastings rifled through the drawers while Judith stood by the window, her arms crossed. Father, do you really think someone pushed her? Judith's voice was low, almost a whisper. Hastings paused, a folded letter in his hand. I don't know, Judith, but Poirot's rarely wrong about these things. He sees what we miss. The letter, written in a shaky hand, caught his attention. He unfolded it, reading aloud. Beware the one who whispers. They know too much. It's not signed. Judith's eyes widened. That sounds like a warning. But who was she afraid of? Before Hastings could answer, a floorboard creaked outside. He spun around, catching a glimpse of a shadow slipping past the door. Stay here, he told Judith, darting into the hallway. The corridor was empty, but a faint scent of tobacco lingered. He returned, frustrated, to find Judith holding a small vial she'd found in Allerton's suitcase. It's labeled digitalis, she said. Isn't that for heart conditions? Hastings nodded, his mind racing. Or, in the wrong dose, a poison. We need to show this to Poirot. Okay? Back in the library, Poirot listened to their findings, his eyes gleaming with interest. The vial of digitalis sat on the table before him, alongside the cryptic letter. Franklin, still present, shifted uncomfortably under Poirot's scrutiny. Digitalis, Poirot mused. A medicine, oui, but also a weapon. Miss Allerton was a nurse. She would know its dangers. And this letter speaks of whispers of knowledge. Someone frightened her enough to make her hide this warning. He turned to Franklin. Doctor, you are a man of science. You know of digitalis, Nan. Have you prescribed it here at Styles? Franklin's jaw tightened. No, I'm not a physician. Work is theoretical. Yet theories, as I said, can inspire actions, Poirot replied. Miss Allerton's death was no accident. The railing was tampered with, the shadow scene. Someone wished her silenced. The room fell silent, the weight of Poirot's words sinking in. Hastings glanced at Judith, who stood pale and silent, her eyes fixed on Franklin. Poirot's gaze followed hers, his mind piecing together the puzzle. Colonel Luttrell Poirot said suddenly, You smoke a pipe, do you not? Luttrell blinked, startled. Yes, what of it? The scent of tobacco was in the corridor outside Miss Allerton's room. Hastings interjected. Just now, when I chased that shadow. Luttrell's face reddened. Are you accusing me, sir? I told you I was shaving. Poirot raised a hand. Peace, Colonel. I accuse no one yet. But the threads of this web are tightening somewhat. Among us is a puppeteer, pulling strings to make others act. Miss Allerton saw something, knew something, and now she is dead. The chapter closed with the guests dispersing, their faces etched with fear and suspicion. Hastings lingered, watching Poirot, cool, stared at the vial of digitalis with a grim expression. "Hastings," Poirot said softly, "this is no ordinary killer. This is a mind that plays with others' fears, their desires, the puppeteers. Strings are invisible, but they are there, okay? And we must cut them before another falls." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across Styles Court, Poirot's words echoed in Hastings' mind. The guests survived the fall, thanks to the quick intervention of the household staff, who had rushed to secure the balcony. Repairs were ordered, the railing replaced, but the incident was no accident. Poirot's knowing nod to Hastings confirmed it. The puppeteer had struck, and the game was far from over. Chapter 4. Whispers in the library. The air at Styles Court carried a chill that seeped into the bones, as if the old manor itself were whispering secrets through its creaking timbers. Hercule Poirot, his wheelchair positioned by a tall window in the drawing room, gazed out at the autumn dusk where skeletal trees clawed at a bruised sky. His sharp eyes, undimmed by age, flickered over the guests milling about, their laughter and clinking glasses masking a tension that only he seemed to notice. Captain Hastings, ever loyal but increasingly anxious, stood nearby, his brow furrowed as he watched Poirot's hands fidget with a blanket draped over his knees. "Mon ami," Poirot said softly, his voice a velvet blade. "You observe, but do you see? The game is afoot, and the players, they do not yet know their roles." Hastings shifted uncomfortably. "I don't like it, Poirot. This place feels wrong. And that Maid Mary, wasn't it? She was trembling when she spoke to you earlier, said something about an evil eye watching her." Poirot's lips twitched into a faint smile. "The young Mary has the instincts of a deer in a forest of wolves. She senses what others dismiss. But fear not, Hastings. The gray cells, they are awake." The evening had begun with a strange civility. The guests gathered for drinks before dinner. The colonel, a barrel-chested man named Reginald Bryce, sparked opinions about military strategy, his face red from whiskey. Nurse Clara Evans, a wiry woman with darting eyes, hovered near the edge of the group, her fingers twisting a handkerchief. Dr. Leonard Franklin, the scientist, with a smile too polished, charmed Judith Hastings, who laughed a little too brightly at his quips. The scholar, Stephen Norton, sat quietly in a corner, his nose buried in a leather-bound book, though his eyes flicked upward now and then, as if cataloging the room. And then there was Judith herself, Hastings' daughter, her auburn hair catching the firelight, her defiance barely concealed beneath her elegance. Dinner had been a battlefield of words. Bryce had clashed with Franklin over some obscure scientific theory, their voices rising until Judith's sharp wit cut through, diffusing the moment with a laugh. But Poirot had watched it all, his silence louder than their shouts. Now, in the quiet of the drawing room, he turned to Hastings. "Tonight, mon ami, you will listen, not with your ears alone, but with your heart. There is a whisper in this house, and it speaks of betrayal." Hastings frowned. "You think someone here is dangerous?" Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Dangerous, yes, but subtle, like a spider, spinning a web, unseen until the prey is caught." The conversation was interrupted by the soft tread of Mary, the maid, entering with a tray of coffee. Her hand shook slightly as she set it down, and Hastings noticed her glance nervously toward the library door across the hall. Poirot's gaze followed hers, and he tilted his head, as if catching a note others missed. "Merci, Mary," Poirot said, his tone gentle but probing. "You are troubled, Nan. Perhaps you have seen something. Or someone. Mary's eyes widened, and she clutched the tray to her chest. It's nothing, sir. Just, I thought I saw someone in the library earlier, watching me through the gap in the door. But when I looked, no one was there. Poirot nodded, as if this confirmed a private theory. In this library, it is a place you visit often. Only to dust, sir. But it's heavy in there, like the air's thick with secrets. She flushed, embarrassed, and hurried out. Hastings leaned closer. What was that about, Poirot? You think she's imagining things? Hastings, the imagination of the young is often clearer than the reason of the old. Come, we must investigate this library. The library at Styles Court was a cavern of shadows, its high shelves groaning under the weight of ancient tomes. Tea, dust, motes danced in the slivers of moonlight that pierced the heavy curtains. Poirot's wheelchair glided silently over the worn rug, guided by Hastings, who muttered about the foolishness of prowling around in the dark. A single lamp flickered on a table, casting eerie shapes across the walls. Poirot gestured toward a mahogany desk cluttered with papers. Search, Hastings. The library is a place where secrets hide in plain sight. Hastings rummaged through the desk, finding nothing but old bills and a faded guest book. But as he reached into a drawer, his fingers brushed something sharper. Torn scrap of paper, its edges jagged, held it to the light, revealing a scrawl of ink in a hurried hand. Beware the one who smiles. Betrayal comes in velvet gloves. Poirot, look at this. Hastings whispered, passing the fragment to his friend. Poirot's eyes narrowed as he studied the words. A warning, Hastings. But from whom and to whom? This is no idle note. It is a piece of the puzzle. Before Hastings could respond, a muffled sound came from the far end of the library, a soft, deliberate creak, like a footstep on a loose floorboard. Hastings froze, his hand instinctively reaching for a poker by the fireplace. Poirot raised a finger, silencing him, and tilted his head, listening. Another creak. Then a whisper, barely audible, but sharp with urgency. She knows too much. It has to stop. Hastings' heart thudded. Who's there? He called, his voice louder than he intended. Silence. Then the scrape of a chair, followed by the faint rustle of fabric. Hastings moved toward the sound, poker raised, but Poirot's hand shot out, gripping his wrist. Nan, Hastings. Not yet. We listen, we learn. The shadows will reveal their master in time. Reluctantly, Hastings lowered the poker, but his eyes scanned the darkness. The library seemed to pulse with secrets, its shelves looming like silent witnesses. Arose. Wheelchair creaked as he maneuvered toward a row of books, his fingers trailing along their spines. Help me, Hastings, he said. There is something here, something hidden. Together, they pulled a heavy volume from the shelf, an encyclopedia, its pages yellowed and brittle. As it fell open, a second scrap of paper fluttered to the floor. This one bore a different message in the same hurried script. The inheritance is the key. Trust no one. Poirot's breath caught. Mon Dieu. The pieces, they begin to align. This inheritance is the thread that binds our puppeteer's web. Hastings frowned. Inheritance? You mean the estate? But Styles belongs to the Cavendish family, doesn't it? Perhaps, Poirot murmured. Or perhaps it is not the estate itself, but what it represents. Power, wealth, control. These are the currencies of betrayal. Their discussion was cut short by the sound of footsteps approaching the library door. Hastings shoved the scraps of paper into his pocket just as the door swung open, revealing Judith, her face pale in the lamplight. Father, Monsieur Poirot. What are you doing in here? Her voice was sharp, but there was a tremor in it, as if she'd been startled. Poirot's expression softened, but his eyes remained piercing. Mademoiselle Judith, we are merely exploring the library. It has a certain charm, Nan. Judith's gaze darted to the open encyclopedia, then back to Poirot. It's late. You should be resting, Monsieur Poirot. Father, you shouldn't let him tire himself. Hastings bristled at her tone, but said nothing. Poirot, however, tilted his head, studying her. You are concerned for me, mademoiselle, or perhaps for something else. Judith flushed. I don't know what you mean. I heard voices and thought someone might be in trouble. Voices. Poirot's tone was deceptively mild. And what did these voices say? Judith hesitated, her fingers twisting the hem of her shawl. It's nothing clear, just murmurs. I thought it was the wind. Poirot nodded, but his eyes told Hastings he believed otherwise. Very well, mademoiselle, we shall retire. Do be careful. The night is full of whispers. As Judith left, Hastings turned to Poirot, his voice low. She's hiding something, isn't she? Poirot's fingers tapped the arm of his wheelchair. She is entangled, Hastings, but whether as a pawn or a player, I cannot yet say. We must watch her closely. The next morning, the library was abuzz with a different kind of tension. Clara Evans, her face drawn, was tidying a stack of books when Poirot and Hastings entered. She started at their arrival, dropping a volume that landed with a thud. Monsieur Poirot, she exclaimed, her voice high. I didn't expect you. Here, Poirot's smile was disarming. The library, it calls to me, Nurse Evans. It is a place of knowledge, yes, and perhaps of secrets. Clara's eyes flicked to the desk where the torn paper had been found. Secrets. I don't know about that. I just keep things tidy. Poirot leaned forward, his voice soft but unyielding. And yet, you are afraid, Nan, of someone who knows too much, perhaps? Clara's hands froze, and for a moment it seemed she might bolt. Then she laughed, a brittle sound. You're imagining things, Monsieur Poirot. I'm just a nurse, not part of your detective games. But Poirot's gaze held her, and she faltered. Very well, she whispered. There's someone here. Someone who watches me. I found a note in my room last night. It said, keep silent, or you'll regret it. I don't know who it's from, but it scared me. Poirot's expression hardened. Show me this note, if you please. Clara hesitated, then pulled a crumpled paper from her apron pocket. It was written in a different hand than the library scraps, blocky and aggressive. Silence is safety. Speak, and you fall. Poirot studied it, then handed it to Hastings. Another piece, Hastings. The puppeteer grows bold, but also careless. This note, it is meant to frighten, but it reveals much. Clara wrung her hands. What does it mean? Who's doing this? Poirot's voice was calm, but firm. It means, Nurse Evans, that you must trust me. Tell me everything you know, and I will protect you. Clara's story spilled out in a rush. She'd overheard a conversation the previous night near the library between two voices she couldn't identify. They spoke of the plan and the old man's fortune. One voice had mentioned a name Cavendish, but it was unclear whether it referred to the estate or a person. She'd fled before she could hear more, terrified of being caught. Poirot listened, his fingers steepled. Mercy, Nurse Evans, you have done well, okay? Now, go about your duties, but say nothing of this to anyone. As Clara left, Hastings turned to Poirot, his voice urgent. Cavendish. That's the family who owns Styles. Could this be about their inheritance? Poirot nodded. It is likely, Hastings. The torn letter in the library, the note to Nurse Evans, they point to a motive, rooted in greed. But the puppeteer, they do not act alone. They pull strings, yes, but others dance for them. The day unfolded with a restless energy, the guests moving through Styles like pieces on a chessboard. Hastings, at Poirot's insistence, kept a close eye on Judith, who seemed distracted, her laughter less frequent. At midday, he found her in the garden, speaking in low tones with Dr. Franklin. Their heads were close, and Franklin's hand rested briefly on her arm, a gesture that made Hastings' stomach twist. He approached, keeping his tone light. "Judith, my dear, you're missing the sunshine. Why hide away with Dr. Franklin?" Judith's smile was strained. "We're just talking, Father. Leonard's been telling me about his work. It's fascinating." Franklin's eyes glinted with amusement. "Your daughter has a sharp mind, Captain. She could be a scientist herself." Hastings forced a smile, but his thoughts were on Poirot's warning about Franklin's unsettling theories. "I'm sure she could. But let's not keep you from the others, Judith." As they walked back to the house, Hastings noticed Franklin's gaze linger on the library windows, as if searching for something or someone. He made a mental note to tell Poirot. That evening, Poirot summoned Hastings to his room, where a small fire crackled in the hearth. The detective's face was pale, but his eyes burned with purpose. He held the 2 scraps of paper from the library, alongside Clara's note. "Observe, Hastings," he said, laying them out. "The library letter speaks of betrayal and inheritance. Nurse Evans' note warns of silence. Together, they tell a story of manipulation. Someone at Styles seeks to control the Cavendish fortune, but they do not act openly. They sow fear, discord, perhaps even death." Hastings' jaw tightened. "And Judith, you think she's caught up in this?" Poirot's expression softened. "She is a pawn, Hastings, but a valuable one. Her connection to Franklin is no coincidence. Key may be the puppeteer's tool, or the puppeteer himself. We must discover which." Knock at the door interrupted them. It was Stephen Norton, the scholar, his face ashen. "Monsieur Poirot, I found something in the library behind a panel. Think it's important." He held out a small, leather-bound notebook, its pages filled with cryptic symbols and dates. Poirot's eyes lit up as he flipped through it. Pausing at a page marked with a single word, "Cavendish." "Mon Dieu," Poirot murmured. The puppeteer pulls tighter. Its notebook. It is a ledger of their schemes. "Sir Norton, you have done well to bring this to me." Norton shifted nervously. "I didn't want to get involved, but I heard voices last night, like you did. I think someone's planning something terrible." Poirot's gaze sharpened. "And you, monsieur, you are certain you heard nothing more?" Norton hesitated, then shook his head. "Just whispers. I couldn't make them out." Norton left Poirot, turned to Hastings, his voice low. "He lies, Hastings. The scholar knows more than he admits. But for now, we have the notebook. This is a key, and we shall use it." The chapter closed with Poirot poring over the notebook, his mind racing to decode its secrets. The library's whispers had grown louder, revealing a web of betrayal centered on the Cavendish name, the torn letters. "Warning, the inheritance is the key. Trust no one," echoed in Hastings' mind as he watched his friend, frail but relentless, tighten his grip on the puppeteer's strings. The game was far from over, but the stakes had never been higher. Chapter 5. The poisoned chalice. The late afternoon sun spilled through the tall windows of Styles Court, casting long shadows across the dining room where the guests had gathered for a celebratory tea. The air was thick with the scent of jasmine from the gardens, mingling with the delicate aroma of freshly brewed Darjeeling. The table, draped in a crisp white cloth, gleamed with polished silver and fine porcelain, a stark contrast to the undercurrents of tension rippling through the room. Hercule Poirot, seated at the head of the table in his wheelchair, his frail frame swathed in a meticulously pressed suit, observed the scene with eyes that missed nothing. Beside him, Captain Hastings fidgeted, his unease palpable as he scanned the faces of the assembled guests. The occasion was ostensibly to mark the birthday of Mrs. Luttrell, a Brosh colonel's wife, whose forced cheerfulness grated against the room's strained atmosphere. Her husband, Colonel Luttrell, sat stiffly, his mustache twitching as he muttered about the damned inconvenience of the gathering. Across from him, the nervous nurse, Miss Cole, adjusted her glasses repeatedly, her fingers trembling as she poured tea. The secretive scholar, Mr. Boyd, scribbled absent-mindedly in a notebook, his eyes darting to the others, as if cataloging their every move. Judith Hastings, vibrant, yet guarded, sat beside Dr. Franklin, the charming scientist, whose easy smile did little to mask the calculating glint in his eyes. And then there was the timid governess, Miss Wren, who seemed to shrink into her chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Poirot's gaze lingered on each guest, his mind a whirl of deductions. He had confided to Hastings earlier that day about the perfect murderer, a figure he called X, who orchestrated death without ever lifting a weapon. The incidents at Styles, the sudden illness, the balcony fall, were no accidents, he was certain. Now, as the clink of teacups filled the air, he sensed the next move in X's deadly game was imminent. Mon ami Poirot murmured to Hastings, his voice barely audible over the chatter. Observe the hands. They betray what the face conceals. Taste. Nodded, his eyes flicking to Miss Wren, whose fingers twisted a napkin into knots. Before he could respond, Mrs. Luttrell raised her teacup with a theatrical flourish. To another year of surviving this dreary place, she declared, her laugh brittle. The others raised their cups in a half-hearted toast, but Poirot's hand remained still, his cup untouched. It happened in an instant. Colonel Luttrell took a sip, then coughed violently, his face contorting. Cup clattered to the table, tea spilling across the cloth like blood. Huh? He clutched his throat, gasping, his eyes wide with panic. The room erupted into chaos. Miss Cole screamed, Judith leapt to her feet, and Dr. Franklin rushed to the colonel's side, barking orders for water. Hastings, frozen for a moment, caught Poirot's calm, piercing stare. Quickly, Hastings. Poirot's voice cut through the din, sharp and commanding, to tray-check the other cups. Hastings lunged for the silver tray, where a second pot of tea sat, intended for the later courses. He lifted a cup, sniffed it, and recoiled at a faint, bitter scent beneath the tea's aroma. Poirot, this one's off, he shouted, shoving it toward Miss Wren, who had reached for it. She froze, her face paling as the cup wobbled in her hand. Set it down, mademoiselle, Poirot ordered, his tone brooking no argument. Miss Wren obeyed, her hands shaking so violently the cup nearly tipped. Dr. Franklin, still kneeling by the colonel, called for his medical bag, while Judith hovered, torn between helping and watching. Her father, Poirot's wheelchair creaked as he leaned forward, his eyes locked on the spilled tea pooling on the table. Monsieur Franklin, he said, his voice deceptively mild, what is your diagnosis? Franklin, pressing a cloth to the colonel's forehead, glanced up. Could be anything: food poisoning, heart trouble, stabilizing, but we need a proper examination. Nan, Poirot said softly. It is poison, a rare toxin, perhaps strychnine or something more exotic. You, a man of science, would know. Franklin's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, focusing on the colonel, who was now breathing shallowly, his face ashen but no longer contorted. Miss Cole, wringing her hands, stammered, poison. But how? The tea came from the kitchen. Surprisement, Poirot said, his gaze sweeping the room. And yet, not all cups were tainted, only some. Why? The guests exchanged uneasy glances, their voices hushed. Mrs. Luttrell, her earlier bravado gone, clutched her husband's arm. You're saying someone tried to kill him? Here? Not just him, Poirot replied, his voice low, but carrying a weight that silenced the room. The second pot, it was meant for another. Hastings, you prevented a tragedy. Bean Jiao Hastings flushed, but his relief was short-lived as suspicion turned to Miss Wren. The governess, barely 20, shrank under the accusing stares. "I didn't. I wouldn't," she cried, her voice breaking. "I only poured the tea." "Poured it? Yes," Mr. Boyd said, his tone cold as he closed his notebook. "But you handled the tray. You were closest to the pots." "That's enough," Judith snapped, stepping protectively in front of Miss Wren. "She's terrified. Look at her. She couldn't harm anyone." "Appearances deceive," Mademoiselle Poirot said, though his eyes softened as he regarded Miss Wren. "But let us not rush to judgment. Hastings, fetch the kitchen staff. We must know who prepared the tea." As Hastings hurried out, Poirot wheeled himself closer to the table, examining the spilled tea with a magnifying glass he produced from his pocket. The guests watched, some with curiosity, others with dread. Miss Cole whispered to Mrs. Luttrell, "He's like a hawk, isn't he? Sees everything." "Too much, if you ask me," Mrs. Luttrell muttered, her eyes narrowing. Hastings returned with the young maid, Elsie, who had spoken to Poirot the previous day about her fears of someone evil. Her face was pale, her apron twisted in her hand. "Sir, I swear I only brewed the tea as Mrs. Luttrell asked. Darjeeling from the tin in the pantry." "And you added nothing else?" Poirot asked, his voice gentle but probing. "Nothing, sir." "I'd never." Elsie's voice cracked, and she looked ready to bolt. Poirot raised a hand, calming her. "I believe you, Elsie, but tell me who had access to the kitchen after you prepared the tray." Elsie hesitated, glancing nervously at the guests. "Well, anyone, really. The kitchen's open to the house. I left the tray on the counter for a bit while I fetched the scones." Poirot nodded, his expression unreadable. "Mercy, Elsie, you may go." As the maid fled, the room buzzed with accusations. Colonel Luttrell, now propped up with a glass of water, growled, "It's that governess. Shifty eyes, always lurking." "Stop it," Judith said, her voice fierce. "You're all turning on her because she's quiet. It's cruel." Poirot raised a hand for silence. "Mesdames, messieurs, accusations without evidence are but noise. Let us consider the facts. The poison was in the tea, but not all the tea. The first pot, from which the colonel drank, was tainted. The second, which Hastings intercepted, was meant for another. It suggests precision, a mind that plans." Dr. Franklin, wiping his hands on a cloth, spoke up. "You're implying someone here is a murderer." "That's a bold claim, Monsieur Poirot." "Bold, perhaps," Poirot said, his eyes glinting, "but true. And you, Doctor, with your knowledge of toxins, must find this most intriguing, Nan?" Franklin's smile faltered, but he recovered quickly. "I studied chemistry, not murder. I'm here to help, not to be accused." "Of course," Poirot said smoothly. "And yet, we must all be questioned. Miss Wren, tell me, when you poured the tea, did you notice anything unusual? A smell? A color?" Miss Wren, her voice barely above a whisper, shook her head. "No, sir. It looked like tea. Just, I poured it, as I was told." "And who told you to pour?" Poirot asked. "Mrs. Luttrell," Miss Wren said, glancing at the colonel's wife, who bristled. "Are you accusing me now?" Mrs. Luttrell snapped. "I organized the tea, yes, but I didn't touch the pots after Elsie brought them." Poirot's lips twitched into a faint smile. "No one accuses, madame. I merely seek the truth." Interrogation continued, Poirot's questions sharp yet measured, peeling back layers of defensiveness. He asked Mr. Boyd about his notebook, which the scholar claimed was for historical notes on styles. He pressed Miss Cole on her nervous demeanor, learning she'd been receiving anonymous notes warning her to watch her back. Each answer added a piece to the puzzle. Poirot's expression remained inscrutable as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the room in twilight. Poirot called for the teapots to be brought to him. With Hastings' help, he examined them closely, sniffing the rims and inspecting the residue. "This," he said, holding up the second pot, "contains the same bitter scent Hastings detected. Toxin, subtle but deadly. And yet, the first pot has a different residue, fainter but distinct." "What does that mean?" Hastings asked, his voice low. "It means," Poirot said, "that our poisoner is clever. 2 poisons, 2 targets. The colonel was to die quickly, to create chaos. The second victim, perhaps Miss Wren, perhaps another, was to linger, to obscure the truth." The room fell silent, the weight of his words sinking in. Miss Wren burst into tears, and Judith wrapped an arm around her, glaring at the others. "This is madness," Judith said. "Who would do this?" "Someone who thrives on control," Poirot said, his voice like steel. "Someone who watches, manipulates, and strikes without touching the blade. But they have made a mistake. The second pot was not drunk from, thanks to Hastings. And now we are closer to unmasking them." He turned to Miss Wren, his tone softening. "Mademoiselle, you are innocent. I see it in your eyes, your fear. You were a convenient scapegoat, nothing more." Miss Wren sobbed with relief, and even Colonel Luttrell grunted an apology. A quailed spring, ready to snap. Poirot leaned back in his wheelchair, his fingers steepled. "We are safe for now," he said, "but only for now. The poisoner will try again, and I, Hercule Poirot, will be waiting." As the guests dispersed, shaken but relieved, Hastings lingered by Poirot's side. "You're sure about Miss Wren?" he asked quietly. "Certain," Poirot said. "Her fear is genuine, her actions clumsy, but honest. The true culprit is among us, Hastings, hiding behind a mask of innocence, and I will find them." So the room emptied, leaving only the faint scent of jasmine and the bitter temps of poison in the air. Poirot's eyes gleamed with determination, his mind already racing toward the next move in this deadly game. The poisoned chalice had been set aside, but the shadow of X loomed larger than ever. And Poirot knew the final act was drawing near. Chapter 6. The Mask of Innocence. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the faded grandeur of Styles Court, its golden rays filtering through the warped panes of the dining room windows. The air was thick with the scent of old wood and wax polish, undercut by a tension that clung to the gathered guests like damp fog. Hercule Poirot, his frail form ensconced in a high-backed wheelchair, sat at the head of the table, his sharp eyes darting from face to face. Captain Arthur Hastings, ever loyal, stood at his side, his weathered hands clasped tightly behind his back, betraying his unease. The room buzzed with a clink of cutlery and strained small talk, but beneath it all, a silent current of dread pulsed. The guests were a motley assembly. Colonel Luttrell, his face flushed with too much wine, barked opinions about military discipline. Nurse Craven, her nervous fingers twisting a napkin into knots, avoided eye contact. Dr. John Franklin, the charismatic scientist, with a smile too polished, leaned close to Judith Hastings, whispering something that made her laugh a sound that grated on her father's nerves. Stephen Norton, a quiet man with wire-rimmed spectacles and a habit of fading into the background, sipped his tea and watched. Always watching, Poirot's gaze lingered on him longest, though no one noticed a flicker of calculation in his eyes. The meal had barely concluded when Colonel Luttrell's voice boomed, ting the fragile civility. "Franklin, your talk of improving the species is hogwash, dangerous hogwash. You scientists think you can play God, but you'll ruin us all." His fist slammed at the table, rattling the china dot. Franklin leaned back, his smile unwavering. "Colonel, progress demands bold ideas. If we don't evolve, we stagnate. Nature's cruel, but science can be kinder." "Kind?" Luttrell scoffed, his mustache quivering. Your kind of kindness would have us all in test tubes. Eyes sparkled with amusement, but Hastings bristled, his protective instincts. Flaring Poirot's hand, trembling slightly, rose to silence the room. Messieurs, mademoiselle, he said, his voice soft but commanding, let us not spoil the digestion with discord. There are other matters to consider. The guests fell silent, their eyes drawn to the diminutive detective. Hastings caught the glint in Poirot's expression, a signal that his friend's mind was already weaving threads into a pattern only he could see. Poirot leaned forward, his fingers steepled. I speak of a presence among us, one who wears the mask of innocence, yet pulls the strings of chaos. I call this person X. A murmur rippled through the room. Nurse Craven's napkin tore under her grip. Franklin's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. Norton adjusted his glasses, his face unreadable. Hastings felt a chill, his mind racing to Poirot's earlier warning. X is a puppeteer, Hastings. They do not kill with their hands, but with the minds of others. What's this nonsense? Luttrell blustered. You're saying one of us is some sort of master criminal? Poirot's lips curled faintly. Colonel, and their weapon is not a blade of poison, but the human heart, its fears, its desires, its weaknesses. Tack. Room erupted in protest, but Poirot's gaze remained fixed, unyielding. Hastings, sensing the rising tension, stepped closer to his friend. Poirot, are you sure this is wise? Accusing someone now? Patience? Mon ami? Poirot murmured. The truth, it reveals itself when the ground is shaken. As the guests dispersed, their voices a cacophony of indignation. Hastings followed Poirot to the library, a cavernous room lined with dusty tomes and heavy curtains. The fire in the hearth cast flickering shadows, and Poirot's wheelchair creaked as he maneuvered to a corner table. Hastings, he said, his voice low, you must watch them all, especially your Judith. Hastings stiffened. Judith. She's headstrong, but she's no fool. She wouldn't be swayed by this. X. Poirot's eyes softened, but his tone was firm. The young, they are vulnerable to charm. Two ideals wrapped in pretty words. Dr. Franklin, he speaks to her heart. But whose heart does he serve? Hastings opened his mouth to argue, but a commotion outside drew their attention. Raised voices echoed from the hall, sharp and heated. Poirot gestured for Hastings to investigate, and he hurried out, his pulse quickening. In the corridor, Colonel Luttrell towered over Franklin, his face scarlet. You stay away from that girl, you hear me? I know your type, smooth-talking vipers. His fists were clenched, trembling with barely contained rage. Franklin raised his hands, his voice calm but edged with mockery. Colonel, your chivalry is touching, but Judith's no damsel in distress. She can handle herself. Handle herself, Luttrell roared. You're filling her head with your blasted theories. Before he could finish, Franklin stepped closer, his smile gone. Careful, Colonel. Threats don't suit a man of your stature. The air crackled with menace, and Hastings, stepping between them, felt the weight of their mutual loathing. Enough. Hastings snapped, his military bearing asserting itself. This is a house, not a battlefield, okay? Take your quarrel elsewhere. Luttrell glared, but backed off, muttering curses as he stormed away. Franklin adjusted his cufflinks, his composure returning. Good man, Hastings. Always the peacemaker. He flashed a grin and sauntered off, leaving Hastings uneasy. There was something in Franklin's eyes, a glint of calculation that echoed Poirot's warnings. Returning to the library, Hastings recounted the scene. Poirot listened, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the arm of his wheelchair. A spark, Hastings, he said. X fans such sparks into flames. This confrontation, it was no accident. But how can you be sure? Hastings asked, frustration creeping into his voice. It's just tempers flaring. Men like Luttrell and Franklin, their oil and water. Poirot's eyes gleamed. And who pours the oil? Mon ami. Who strikes the match? X does not act, they provoke. They whisper, they nudge, they plant the seeds of violence. As night fell, the house grew quiet, but the silence was oppressive, like the calm before a storm. Hastings, unable to sleep, wandered the corridors, his thoughts tangled with worry. For Judith. She had always been fiercely independent, but her fascination with Franklin was new, unsettling. He paused outside her room, tempted to knock, but thought better of it. Instead, he headed to the study, where Poirot had asked to be. Left alone to think, the study door was ajar, and a faint rustle drew Hastings' attention. Peering inside, he saw a figure, hunched over a desk, rifling through papers. The dim light revealed Stephen Norton, his usually meek demeanor replaced by a furtive intensity. Hastings' heart pounded. Could Norton be X before he could act? Norton froze, sensing a presence, and slipped something into his pocket. He turned, his eyes meeting Hastings, and for a moment, neither moved. "Captain Hastings," Norton said, his voice smooth but strained. "Couldn't sleep either." "What were you doing?" Hastings demanded, stepping into the room. Norton's smile was thin. "Looking for a book. This old place has a fascinating collection." He gestured vaguely to the shelves, but his hand lingered near his pocket. Hastings' instincts screamed to confront him, but Poirot's voice echoed in his mind. "Trust no one. It's late," he said instead. "You should get some rest." Norton nodded, his eyes unreadable, and slipped past, leaving Hastings alone with his suspicions. He searched the desk, finding nothing but scattered papers, till his fingers brushed a small, leather-bound diary tucked beneath a blotter. Its pages were filled with cryptic notes, dates, and initials. Some matching past incidents Poirot had linked to X1 entry chilled him. Styles, 1925. The perfect crime begins with trust betrayed. Hastings hurried to Poirot's room. The diary clutched tightly. Poirot, propped against pillows, looked frailer than ever, but his eyes blazed with life as Hastings recounted the night's events. He handed over the diary, and Poirot's fingers trembled as he traced the words. "Mon Dieu," he whispered. "This is the hand of X, not the killer, but the one who shapes the killer's mind." "But Norton," Hastings asked, "he's so unremarkable." Poirot's smile was grim. "The perfect mask, Hastings. Innocence is the greatest disguise, but we must be certain. X is clever. They leave no fingerprints, only whispers." The next morning, the house buzzed with renewed tension. Judith, oblivious to her father's concerns, sat with Franklin in the garden, their heads bent close over a notebook filled with scientific diagrams. Hastings watched from a distance, his heart heavy. Poirot wheeled out to join him, followed. His gaze, "She is your heart, Hastings," he said softly. "But you must not let love blind you. X will use her, if they can." As the day wore on, Poirot's words proved prophetic. At lunch, a seemingly trivial dispute erupted when Nurse Craven accused Franklin of tampering with her medical bag. "Know what I saw?" she cried, her voice shrill. "You were in my room last night." Franklin laughed, but it was hollow. "Nurse, you're overworked. I've no interest in your needles and potions." The accusation hung in the air, and Hastings noticed Norton watching from the corner, his expression unreadable. Before anyone could respond, a crash echoed from the hall. The guests rushed out to find a heavy vase shattered on the floor, inches from where Colonel Luttrell stood, his face pale. "Someone pushed it," he growled. "I felt it." The guests exchanged uneasy glances, but no one admitted guilt. Poirot wheeled to the scene, examined the fragments with a magnifying glass. "Interesting," he murmured. "The base is worn, but not broken. This was no accident." The house descended into chaos, with accusations flying, pointed at Franklin, who pointed at Norton, who remained silent. Judith, caught in the middle, pleaded for calm, but her voice was drowned out. Hastings, desperate to restore order, stepped forward, but Poirot's hand gripped his arm. Nan, Hastings, let them speak. X thrives in this discord. That evening, Poirot summoned Hastings to his room. Okay, the diary, he said, holding it up. It confirms what I feared. Okay, has orchestrated crimes before murders, disguised as accidents, suicides, quarrels gone too far. They are here, among us, and they are close to their final act. But who? Hastings demanded. Norton? Franklin? Someone else? Poirot's eyes were grave. I do not yet know, mon ami. But I tell you this, trust no one, not even your Judith. X's power lies in turning the innocent into pawns. The words struck Hastings like a blow. He wanted to protest, to defend his daughter, but the weight of Poirot's conviction silenced him. As he left the room, the diary's words burned in his mind. Trust betrayed. The house felt smaller, its shadows darker, and for the first time, Hastings wondered if even Poirot could outwit the invisible hand of X. The chapter closed with the guests retiring to their rooms, the air thick with suspicion. Poirot, alone in his wheelchair, stared into the dying fire, his mind racing. The fight had been diffused, the diary's discovery a step forward, but X remained elusive, their mask of innocence intact. The game was far from over. Chapter 7. The trap is set. The air at Styles Court carried a chill that went beyond the late autumn frost. It seeped into the bones, a quiet warning of something sinister stirring beneath the surface of the crumbling manor. Hercule Poirot, confined to his wheelchair, sat by the tall window in the morning room, his sharp eyes scanning the grounds. The manicured lawns, now patchy and overgrown, stretched toward the skeletal trees, their branches clawing at a gray sky. His fingers, gnarled but steady, tapped a rhythm on the armrest, a metronome to his racing thoughts. Captain Arthur Hastings, standing nearby, fidgeted with his cufflinks, his unease palpable. Mon ami, Poirot said, his voice low but carrying the weight of certainty. Today, we tighten the noose. The one we seek, this X, grows restless, and restlessness breeds mistakes. Hastings turned, his brow furrowed. You're certain this plan of yours will work, Poirot? Spreading rumors about your health, it's risky. If X is as clever as you say, they'll see through it. Poirot's lips curled into a faint smile, his mustache twitching. Precisement, Hastings. They will suspect a trap, but suspicion is their weakness. They will act to prove me wrong, to show their power, and in that act, they will reveal themselves. The plan was audacious, even for Poirot. Over the past days, he had instructed Hastings to let slip to the other guests discreetly, of course, that the great detective's health was failing rapidly. A whisper to the nervous nurse, Miss Collins, about Poirot's fading strength. A murmured comment to the brash Colonel Ramsay about the detective's final days. A carefully staged coughing fit in front of the secretive scholar. Mr. Latham, the goal was to provoke X, the unseen manipulator orchestrating the string of accidents at Styles, into making a bold move. Poirot believed X thrived on control, and the idea of his impending death would be an irresistible challenge. The morning room was quiet, save for the distant clatter of dishes from the kitchen. The guests were scattered across the estate, some in the library, others strolling the grounds, but Poirot had ensured they would gather soon. He had requested a late luncheon, seemingly innocent event that would bring everyone together under his watchful eye. Hastings, Poirot said, his tone shifting to one of quiet urgency, you must be my eyes tonight. X is cunning, but they are not invisible. Watch for the one who lingers too long, who asks too many questions, or who avoids them entirely. Hastings nodded, though his stomach churned. The thought of Judith, his daughter, entangled with the dubious Dr. Franklin, gnawed at him. Poirot's suspicions about Franklin as a potential pawn of X had only deepened, and Hastings feared for Judith's safety. "I'll keep an eye on her too," he said, his voice tight. Poirot's gaze softened, but only for a moment. "Bond, but do not let your heart blind you, mon ami. Judith is strong, but even the strong can be swayed by charm." Luncheon was set in the grand dining room, its faded opulence a stark contrast to the tension simmering among the guests. The long mahogany table, scarred from years of neglect, was draped with a crisp white cloth, and mismatched silverware gleamed under the chandelier's dim light. Poirot, wheeled to the head of the table by reluctant Miss Collins, surveyed the room like a general before battle. Hastings took his place to Poirot's right, his eyes darting between the guests. Colonel Ramsay, his face flushed from a morning brandy, sat opposite the nervous Miss Collins, who clutched her napkin as if it were a lifeline. Mr. Latham, the scholar, adjusted his spectacles and scribbled notes in a small leather book, his lips pursed in thought. Judith, radiant but guarded, sat beside Dr. Franklin, whose easy smile and polished demeanor seemed to Hastings like a mask. The young maid, Elsie, moved silently, serving soup with trembling hands, her eyes darting to Poirot as if seeking reassurance. The meal began with strained pleasantries, the clink of spoons against bowls punctuating awkward silences. Colonel Ramsay launched into a loud tale of his military days, his voice drowning out Miss Collins' timid attempts to join the conversation. Judith laughed at something Franklin whispered, and Hastings' grip tightened on his spoon. Poirot, however, remained silent, his eyes flicking from face to face, cataloguing every gesture, every glance. It was then that Elsie, carrying a tureen of steaming soup, stumbled. The heavy ceramic slipped from her hands, crashing to the floor, in a spray of broth and shattered porcelain. She gasped, her face pale, and dropped to her knees to gather the pieces. "Oh, I'm so sorry," she stammered, her voice trembling. I don't know what happened." Miss Collins rushed to help, but Poirot raised a hand, his voice calm but commanding. "Leave it, mademoiselle. It is but an accident. Turn to the kitchen, si vous plot." Elsie nodded, tears brimming, and fled the room. Hastings caught the briefest exchange of glances between Franklin and Latham flicker, almost imperceptible, but enough to set his nerves on edge. Poirot, too, had seen it. His eyes narrowed, but he said nothing, instead lifting his spoon with deliberate slowness. The meal continued, though the atmosphere grew heavier. Colonel Ramsay's stories faltered, and even Judith's laughter faded. Poirot, breaking his silence, began to speak in a low, deliberate tone. "My friends," he said, "I must confess, my time at Styles has been illuminating. I fear my strength wanes. The weight of years, you understand, is a formidable foe." A murmur rippled through the table. Miss Collins looked alarmed, while Ramsay snorted, muttering something about old men and their dramatics. Franklin leaned forward, his expression one of polite concern. "Surely, Monsieur Poirot, you have many years left to us." Poirot's smile was thin. "Perhaps, but one must be prepared. I've seen much in my time, crimes of passion, of greed, of cunning, and here, at Styles, I sense something familiar. A shadow that moves unseen." The room fell silent. Latham's pen froze mid-scratch. Judith's eyes widened, and Hastings felt a prickle of dread. Poirot's words were bait, and someone at this table was meant to bite. That night, under a moonless sky, Hastings took up his post as Poirot's eyes. The manor was a labyrinth of creaking floors and shadowed corners, and every sound seemed amplified in the stillness. Poirot had retired early, claiming exhaustion, but Hastings knew it was part of the ruse. The detective was likely awake in his room, piecing together the day's observations with his relentless little gray cells. Hastings moved quietly through the upper corridor, his footsteps muffled by the threadbare runner. His task was to watch for anything unusual. Guest out of place, a door left ajar, a whispered conversation. He paused near Judith's room, his heart heavy. The thought of her with Franklin, a man Poirot suspected of being manipulated by X, was unbearable. He shook his head, forcing himself to focus. A faint, scuffing sound came from the stairwell. Hastings froze, his breath catching. He crept toward the sound, his hand brushing the wall for balance. At the landing, he peered down into the darkened foyer. A figure moved below, cloaked in shadow, their steps deliberate but soft. Hastings' pulse quickened. He descended the stairs, keeping to the edges to avoid creaks. The figure paused near the library door, their silhouette barely discernible. Hastings squinted, trying to make out details of man's build, perhaps, but the darkness obscured the face. The figure slipped inside, and Hastings followed, his heart pounding. He eased the door open, peering into the library's gloom. Shelves loomed like silent sentinels, their books shrouded in dust. A single candle flickered on a table, casting jagged shadows. The figure stood near the fireplace, their back to Hastings. They were rifling through a stack of papers, their movements quick and precise. Hastings took a step forward, then froze as the floorboard beneath him groaned. The figure spun around, and for a fleeting moment, Hastings saw the glint of spectacles. But before he could be sure, the figure doused the candle and bolted toward the French doors, leading to the terrace. Todders gave chase, bursting onto the terrace just in time to see the figure vanish into the gardens. He hesitated, torn between pursuit and returning to Poirot. The night was too dark, the grounds too vast. He cursed under his breath and hurried back to Poirot's room, his mind racing. Poirot was awake, propped against pillows, a small lamp casting a warm glow over his face. His eyes gleamed with anticipation as Hastings recounted the encounter. "You did well, mon ami," Poirot said, his voice steady. "This prowler confirms what I suspected. X is searching for something, perhaps evidence of their own machinations. But they are rattled, Hastings. The trap is working." "Okay, was it?" Hastings pressed, frustration creeping into his voice. "Latham, Franklin, someone else." Poirot's fingers steepled beneath his chin. "Patience, Hastings. The night is not yet over. X will make another move, and when they do, we will be ready." The next morning, the manor buzzed with unease. Elsie, still shaken from her mishap, at luncheon whispered to Hastings that she'd heard footsteps in the attic the previous night. Colonel Ramsay complained loudly about the damned creaky house, while Miss Collins seemed on the verge of tears, muttering about bad omens. Judith, to Hastings' relief, kept her distance from Franklin. Though her eyes were troubled, Poirot, however, was calm, almost serene. He summoned Hastings to the morning room, where he revealed the next phase of his plan. "Tonight," he said, "we will stage a crisis. I have let it be known that I possess a documented list of names, perhaps, or a confession that could expose X. I have hinted it is hidden in my room. If X is as desperate as I believe, they will come for it." Hastings stared, aghast. "You're making yourself a target, Poirot. If X is capable of murder, which they are," Poirot interrupted, his tone firm, "but I am not without resources, mon ami. Q will guard the corridor, and I have taken precautions." That evening, as the manor settled into an uneasy quiet, the air grew thick with anticipation. Hastings took his position in the corridor, hidden in an alcove near Poirot's room. The house seemed to hold its breath, every creak and sigh magnified. Hours passed, and Hastings' eyelids grew heavy. Huh. But he forced himself to stay alert. At last, a soft thud came from the far end of the corridor. Hastings peered out, his heart in his throat. A figure approached, moving with the stealth of a predator. They paused at Poirot's door, their hand testing the knob. Hastings held his breath, ready to spring, but the figure hesitated, then retreated, melting back into the shadows. Moments later, a scream shattered the silence. It came from the east wing, near the guest rooms. Hastings bolted toward the sound, his mind racing. Had X struck elsewhere? He reached the east wing to find Miss Collins, pale and trembling, pointing to a crumpled figure on the floor. It was Mr. Latham, his body twisted at an unnatural angle. A noose, of course, rope around his neck. Hastings knelt beside him, checking for a pulse, but the scholar's eyes stared blankly at the ceiling. The other guests arrived, drawn by the scream. Colonel Ramsay, red-faced and shouting. Judith, her hands clasped in horror. Franklin, his face unreadable. Poirot appeared moments later, wheeled by Elsie, his expression grim but unsurprised. Mon Dieu, Poirot murmured, his eyes scanning the scene. It is as I feared. The guests erupted into chaos, accusations flying. Ramsay pointed at Franklin, claiming he'd seen him near the east wing earlier. Judith defended Franklin, her voice shaking. Collins sobbed, muttering about curses. But Poirot's voice cut through the din like a blade. Silence, he commanded. This is no accident. Nor is it suicide. Monsieur Latham was murdered, and the one responsible is among us. He wheeled closer, his gaze locking onto the noose. Observe, he said, pointing to a small pocket watch lying beside Latham's body. This watch is not his. It belongs to another clumsy attempt to stage a suicide, but the time is wrong. The watch stopped at midnight, yet the body is still warm. The killer placed it here, hoping to mislead us. Hastings stared, his mind catching up. You mean this was planned? Poirot said, his voice low. But the plan has failed. Its trap is set, and X has stumbled. T meant to silence Latham, perhaps because he knew too much. But in their haste, they have left a trail. The guests fell silent, their eyes darting nervously. Poirot's words hung in the air, a challenge to the unseen killer. Hastings felt a surge of admiration for his friend, whose mind remained a beacon in the darkness. But the weight of Latham's death pressed heavily on him, and the thought of Judith's safety gnawed at his heart. As the guests dispersed, Poirot beckoned Hastings closer. Tonight was a victory, mon ami, but not the final one. X is cornered, and a cornered beast is dangerous. We must be vigilant. Hastings nodded, his resolve hardening. The trap was tightening, but the game was far from over. Somewhere in the shadows of Styles Court, X was watching, waiting for their next chance to strike. Chapter 8. The gray cells stirred the morning at Styles Court, broke with a deceptive calm, the kind that cloaks a storm. Hercule Poirot, confined to his wheelchair, sat by the tall window of the morning room, his sharp eyes scanning the mist-draped gardens. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and fading roses, and the manor's ancient walls seemed to hum with secrets. Captain Arthur Hastings, his loyal friend, stood nearby, his brow furrowed as he watched Poirot's fingers tap rhythmically on the arm-rested sign of the detective's mind at work. Mon ami. Ha, Poirot said, his voice low but firm. The game, it accelerates. Our adversary, this X, grows bold, but in boldness lies error. The gray cells, they stir. Hastings turned, his mustache twitching with unease. You've said that before, Poirot, but I don't see it. Everyone's on edge after that. Business with the balcony and the poison tea. Now you're saying X is getting careless. Oh, Poirot's lips curled into a faint, knowing smile. When the puppeteer pulls too many strings, Hastings, the puppet, begins to falter. X thrives on discord, turning friend against friend, ally against ally. But in their haste to weave this chaos, they leave traces small, yes, but to Poirot, they are as clear as the sun. Before Hastings could press further, the door creaked open, and Judith, his spirited daughter, entered. Her auburn hair was loosely tied, and her eyes held a spark of defiance that made Hastings' heart ache with both pride and worry. She carried a tray of tea, her movements brisk but careful. "Father, Monsieur Poirot," she said, setting the tray down. "You're both looking grim. What's happened now?" Poirot's gaze softened, but only slightly. "Mademoiselle Judith, you are observant, but you must be cautious. The air at Styles, it is heavy with deception. Tell me, have you spoken with Dr. Franklin today?" Judith's cheeks flushed, and Hastings caught the flicker of discomfort in her eyes. "Not much," she said, too quickly. "He's been in the library all morning, muttering about his experiments." "Why do you ask?" Poirot tilted his head, studying her. "Because, ma chère, those who seem most innocent may be caught in the web of another. Dr. Franklin, he speaks of science, but his words carry a shadow. You will do well to keep your distance." Judith bristled. "I'm not a child, Monsieur Poirot. I can handle myself." Hastings stepped forward, his voice gentle but firm. "Judith, listen to him. There's something wrong here. You've seen it, the accidents, the tension. Poirot knows what he's talking about." She sighed, her shoulders slumping. "Fine, I'll be careful, but you two are like hounds, sniffing at nothing." She turned to leave, but paused at the door. "And the Colonel's been pacing the terrace all morning. He looks like he's about to punch someone. Thought you should know." As the door clicked shut, Poirot's eyes gleamed. "The Colonel, oui, a man of temper, easily provoked. And yet, Hastings, I wonder, does he act of his own accord, or is he another pawn in X's game?" The day unfolded with a restless energy. The guests at Styles Court moved like pieces on a chessboard, each step watched by Poirot's unyielding gaze. By noon, the sky had darkened, heavy clouds promising rain. Hastings, at Poirot's behest, ventured to the lake at the edge of the estate, a place where the guests often wandered. Poirot had insisted on it, claiming the lake held a clue to X's next act. The lake was a mirror of slate, fringed by willows that drooped like mourners. Hastings scanned the area, his boots sinking into the muddy bank. A small rowboat bobbed gently, tied to a weathered dock. Something about it nagged at him. The rope looked frayed, almost deliberately so. He knelt to inspect it, his fingers tracing the uneven strands. "Odd," he muttered. "This doesn't look natural." A rustle in the bushes made him jump. He turned, hand on his cane, to see the nervous nurse, Miss Clara, emerge, her face pale. "Captain Hastings, you startled me," she gasped, clutching a shawl around her shoulders. "What are you doing out here?" "Could I ask you the same?" Hastings replied, straightening. "Just checking the boat. Seems someone's been tampering with it." Her eyes widened, and she took a step back. "Tampering? Oh, heavens, not another accident." I was just walking, trying to clear my head. This place, it's suffocating." Hastings softened, sensing her genuine fear. "Miss Clara, if you know something, you must tell Poirot. He can help." She shook her head, her voice barely a whisper. "I can't. They'd know. They always know." Before he could press her, she hurried away, her shawl trailing like a ghost. Back at the manor, Hastings recounted the encounter to Poirot, who listened with rapt attention. "The rope, you say? Frayed, but not by time alone. Okay. Interesting. And Miss Clara, she flees from questions." The lake, Hastings it, is no mere backdrop. It is a stage for X's next performance. That afternoon, the rain arrived, a relentless downpour that trapped the guests indoors. The drawing room buzzed with strained conversation. The colonel's booming voice cutting through the chatter as he argued with Dr. Franklin over some trivial matter. Judith sat by the fire, her eyes distant, while the secretive scholar, Mr. Lyle, scribbled furiously in a notebook, his pen scratching like a warning. Poirot wheeled to the center of the room, clapped his hands for attention. "Mies, Amos," he said, his voice carrying a quiet authority. "I propose a game to lighten this dreary day, a game of stories. Each of you shall tell a tale of betrayal, for is it not the oldest of human sins?" The guests exchanged uneasy glances, but Poirot's charm was disarming. One by one, they complied, weaving tales of treachery from history or imagination. The colonel spoke of a mutiny in his regiment, his face flushed with old anger. Miss Clarice' story faltered, her words vague, as if she feared revealing too much. Dr. Franklin's tale was clinical, a chilling account of a scientist betrayed by his own ambition. Judith's story, to Hastings' surprise, was sharp and poignant, about a daughter who trusted the wrong mentor. When it was Mr. Lyle's turn, he hesitated, his eyes darting to Poirot. "I'm no storyteller," he said curtly. "Pass." Rose' smile didn't waver. "A pity, Monsieur Lyle, for every man has a story. Nan, perhaps yours is yet to be told." As the game ended, a folded note slipped from Lyle's notebook, unnoticed by all but Poirot. Hastings, at a nod from his friend, retrieved it later, finding it under a chair. The note was scrawled in hasty script. "The final act approaches. Beware. The water." Poirot's eyes narrowed as he read it, his fingers trembling slightly, not from weakness, but from the thrill of the chase. "The lake," he murmured. "X plants their coup de grace there, but we shall be ready." At evening, the rain eased, and the guests, restless, wandered the grounds. Hastings, following Poirot's instructions, kept watch by the lake, his coat soaked through. The boat was still there, its rope now suspiciously loose. As he bent to secure it, a shadow moved in the distance, a figure, cloaked and swift, vanishing into the willows. Hastings gave chase, his heart pounding, but the figure was gone, leaving only a faint scent of tobacco in the air. He returned to Poirot, breathless, and relayed the sighting. Poirot nodded, his mind racing. "Tobacco, you say, only to hear indulge the colonel and Mr. Lyle. But the scent, it is not enough. We must provoke X into action." Poirot's plan was daring. He instructed Hastings to spread a rumor among the staff that Poirot's health was failing rapidly, that he might not survive the week. "Let X believe I am no threat," Poirot said. "Their arrogance will be their undoing." By nightfall, the rumor had spread, and the manor buzzed with whispers. At dinner, the atmosphere was electric, every glance charged with suspicion. Judith, seated beside Dr. Franklin, laughed too loudly at his jests, and Hastings' stomach knotted. Was she falling under his spell, or was she playing her own game? As the guests retired, Poirot summoned Hastings to his room. "Mon ami, tonight we watch the lake. X will strike, I am certain. Bring your revolver." Hastings balked. "My revolver." "Poirot, you're not suggesting I suggested nothing," Poirot interrupted, his voice steel. "But we face a mind as cunning as my own. Be prepared." Under the cover of darkness, they positioned themselves near the lake. Poirot, wrapped in blankets, his wheelchair hidden by a cluster of shrubs. The night was still, the only sound the gentle lapping of water. Hours passed, and Hastings' eyelids grew heavy. Then, a creek the boat was moving, untied, drifting toward the center of the lake. A figure stood in it, indistinct in the moonlight. "There," Hastings whispered, gripping his revolver. "Patience," Poirot hissed. We must see their intent. The figure bent, as if adjusting something in the boat. A faint splash followed, and the boat rocked violently. Hastings lunged forward, shouting, "Stop!" The figure leaped into the water, swimming for the far bank. Hastings waded in, ignoring Poirot's protests, but the cold gripped him. The figure vanished into the night. When he returned, soaked and shivering, Poirot was already examining the boat, now dragged to shore by a groundskeeper. "Regard us," Poirot said, pointing to a small hole drilled in the hull, plugged with a dissolvable wax. "A trap, Hastings. Had someone rowed out, the boat would have sunk. A drowning, blamed on accident." "But who was it?" Hastings demanded, teeth chattering. Poirot's eyes gleamed in the moonlight. "X grows careless, as I said. The wax. It is a chemist's trick doctor. Franklin, perhaps, or Mr. Lyle, with his secretive notes. We are close, mon ami." The next morning, Poirot gathered the guests in the drawing room, his face pale but resolute. "Madame et messieurs," he began, "last night an attempt was made to stage a tragedy at the lake. A boat, tampered to sink, was meant to claim a life. But the gray cells of Hercule Poirot, they do not sleep." The room erupted in gasps and accusations. Dr. Franklin's face was a mask of calm, but his hands twitched. Mr. Lyle's pen stilled, his eyes locked on Poirot. The colonel blustered, demanding answers, while Miss Clara shrank into her chair. Poirot raised a hand for silence. "The one who did this, they are among us, but I say to them, your mask slips. Your next move, it will be your last." As the guests dispersed, Judith approached Poirot, her voice low. "You're pushing them, aren't you, to make a mistake?" Poirot nodded, a rare warmth in his eyes. "You are your father's daughter, mademoiselle. I push, and soon, X will fall." The chapter closed with Poirot alone, staring at the lake from his window. The note the final act approaches lay on his lap, its words a challenge he was ready to meet. His gray cells stirred, alive with the certainty that X's recklessness would be their downfall. Chapter 9. The Moral Dilemma. The late afternoon sun cast long, jagged shadows across the grounds of Styles Court, as if the manor itself was stretching out to grasp the secrets hidden within its walls. Hercule Poirot sat in his wheelchair by the tall library window, his frail hands folded over a tartan blanket, his sharp eyes tracing the silhouettes of bare trees against the amber sky. The air was thick with the scent of old books and a faint tang of wood smoke from the fireplace. Hastings stood nearby, his brow furrowed, watching his old friend with a mixture of concern and unease. The events of the past days, poisoned tea, a tampered boat, a staged suicide had left the household in a state of brittle tension, and Poirot's cryptic remarks about the elusive X only deepened the disquiet. "Hastings," Poirot said, softly, his voice carrying the weight of a man who had seen too much. "You have observed, have you not, the way the wind bends the branches? It does not break them, but it shapes their path. So it is with our X. He does not wield the knife himself, but he bends others to his will." Hastings shifted uncomfortably, his fingers tightening around the back of a leather chair. "I don't like it, Poirot. It's talk of a manipulator, someone pulling strings. It's like chasing a ghost." And Judith's voice faltered as he mentioned his daughter, his eyes darting to the door as if she might appear. "She's caught up in this, isn't she, with that Franklin fellow?" Poirot's gaze remained fixed on the window, but his lips curved into a faint, melancholic smile. "Your daughter, mon amie, is a woman of spirit, but spirit can be misled. Dr. Franklin is a man of charm, yes, but charm is a mask that hides many faces. We must protect her, but we must also act with precision. The hour grows late." The library door creaked open, and Judith herself stepped inside, her auburn hair catching the firelight. She wore a tailored green dress, but her usual poise was frayed. Her fingers twisted the hem of her sleeve, and her eyes flickered with defiance and something softer, almost vulnerable. "Qui, Monsieur Poirot," she said, her tone clipped, but polite. "I didn't expect to find you here. Thought you'd be resting." Poirot tilted his head, his mustache twitching slightly. "Rest, mademoiselle, is for those who have no puzzles to solve. And you, I think, are part of the puzzle." Judith's cheeks flushed, and she crossed her arms. "Not a child, Monsieur Poirot. I can handle my own affairs. If you're talking about Richard Dr. Franklin, he's not what you think. He's brilliant, not some villain in one of your stories." Hastings took a step forward, his voice tight. "Shh, Judith, you barely know the man. He's got ideas, dangerous ones, about improving humanity, culling the weak. Heard him at dinner the other night. That's not brilliance. It's madness." Judith's eyes flashed. "You don't understand him, Papa. He's passionate, not cruel. He wants to make the world better, not destroy it." Poirot raised a hand, silencing the brewing argument. "Mademoiselle Judith, permit me to ask, has Dr. Franklin spoken to? You have plans to leave Styles, to, perhaps, elope?" The question hung in the air like a blade. Judith's lips parted, but no sound came. Her gaze darted to the floor, then back to Poirot, her defiance crumbling under his unyielding scrutiny. "How did you?" She stopped herself, then straightened. "Yes, he's mentioned leaving. Together. But it's not what you think. It's not some scandal. You want a life where we can be free, where his work can matter." Hastings' face reddened, and he opened his mouth to protest, but Poirot's sharp glance held him back. "In this work," Poirot continued, his voice calm but probing, "it involves experiments, does it not? Experiments that require sacrifices." Judith's expression hardened. "You're twisting things. Richard's research is about saving lives, not taking them. He's not your murderer." "Perhaps not," Poirot said, his tone deceptively mild. "But he is a man who plays with fire, and fire, mademoiselle, does not choose its victims. It consumes all in its path." Before Judith could respond, a sharp knock echoed from the door, and the nervous nurse, Miss Cole, peered in. Her pale face was drawn, her hands clutching a folded cloth as if it were a lifeline. "Monsieur Poirot, Captain Hastings," she said, her voice trembling. I need to speak with you. It's urgent." Poirot gestured for her to enter, his eyes narrowing. "Speak, mademoiselle. What troubles you?" Miss Cole hesitated, glancing at Judith, who lingered by the fireplace, her expression unreadable. It's about Dr. Franklin," the nurse said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I overheard him in the garden this morning, talking to someone. I couldn't see who. But he was angry. I said something about finishing it tonight, and no more mistakes. I thought you should know." Judith spun around, her voice sharp. "You were eavesdropping. That's low, even for you, Miss Cole." The nurse flinched, but held her ground. "I wasn't spying. I was tending the roses, and they were loud. I'm only telling the truth." "Enough," Poirot said, his voice cutting through the tension. "Miss Cole, you have done well to come to me. Turn to your duties, and say nothing of this to anyone else." The nurse nodded, casting a wary glance at Judith before slipping out. Judith turned to Poirot, her eyes blazing. "You're all wrong about him. I'm going to find Richard and prove it." Before Hastings could stop her, she stormed out, the door slamming behind her. Hastings ran a hand through his hair, his voice thick with frustration. "She's too stubborn for her own good. What if Franklin's dangerous? What if he's X?" Poirot's fingers tapped lightly on the arm of his wheelchair. "Dr. Franklin is a piece of the puzzle, Hastings. But whether he is the hand that moves the pieces, that remains to be seen. We must act quickly. Tonight we shall set a stage, and Dr. Franklin will play his part, willingly or not." The dining room that evening was a study in unease. The long mahogany table gleamed under the chandelier, but the guests' faces were taut, their laughter forced. The brash Colonel Luttrell stabbed at his roast with unnecessary force. His wife, murmuring placations, the secretive scholar, Mr. Boyd, kept his eyes on his plate, while Miss Cole darted nervous glances at Dr. Franklin, who sat at the far end, his charming smile intact, but his eyes cold. Judith sat beside him, her posture rigid, her hand brushing his arm in a gesture that made Hastings' jaw tighten. Poirot, positioned at the head of the table, seemed smaller than ever in his wheelchair, yet his presence commanded the room. Sipped his tisane, his eyes moving from face to face, as if reading a map only he could see. "Miss Amos," he began, his voice carrying a theatrical lilt, "tonight we dine not only on fine food, but on truth. For too long, shadows have danced among us, and it is time to bring them into the light." The room fell silent, forks pausing. Mid-air, Colonel Luttrell snorted. "More of your riddles, Poirot. If you've got something to say, spit it out." Poirot's smile was thin. "Patience, Colonel. It's the truth, like a fine wine, must be savored. But I will say this, there is one among us who weaves a web of deceit, who turns friend against friend, who sows discord as a farmer sows seed. This person, this X, is here tonight." A murmur rippled through the guests. Judith's eyes narrowed, and Franklin leaned forward, his smile tightening. "That's a bold claim, Monsieur Poirot," Franklin said, his voice smooth, but edged. "Care to name this villain, or are we all to play guessing games?" Poirot's gaze locked onto Franklin's, unyielding. "In time, Doctor. But first, let us test the waters. I propose a small experiment, quarrel, staged for our benefit, to see who rises to the bait." Hastings, seated beside Poirot, stiffened. This was the plan Poirot had outlined earlier, staged confrontation to provoke a reaction. But the details had been vague, and Hastings' unease grew as Poirot's eyes flicked to him, silent command to follow his lead. "Captain Hastings," Poirot said, his voice rising, "you have been most vocal about your distrust of certain guests. Perhaps you would share your concerns with us now." Hastings swallowed, his throat dry. He glanced at Judith, who stared back, her expression a mix of hurt and defiance. I've seen things," he began, his voice halting but growing firmer as he played his part. "Dr. Franklin, your talk of improving humanity is unsettling. You speak of culling the weak as if lives are yours to judge. And now my daughter's caught up in your schemes. I won't stand for it." The room erupted. Judith shot to her feet, her chair scraping against the floor. "Papa, how dare you? Richard's done nothing but try to help me, to give me a future. You're embarrassing yourself." Franklin placed a hand on Judith's arm, his smile calm but his eyes glinting. "Captain Hastings, I understand your concern, but you misunderstand my work. I'm a scientist, not a monster. If you have accusations, make them plainly." Colonel Luttrell slammed his fist on the table, his face red. "Enough of this nonsense, accusing a man without proof. You're stirring up trouble, Poirot, and I've had it with your games." Poirot raised a hand, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Silence, if you please. This is no game, Colonel. It is a test, and already the threads of the web tremble." Guests fell quiet, their eyes darting between Poirot, Hastings, and Franklin. Miss Cole clutched her napkin, her knuckles white. Mr. Boyd adjusted his glasses, his expression unreadable. Judith sank back into her seat, her face pale, while Franklin's smile never wavered. Poirot leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Dr. Franklin, you speak of science, but your words carry a darker intent. I have heard of your experiments that require subjects, willing or not. Tell me, doctor, what did you mean when you spoke of finishing it tonight?" Franklin's smile faltered, just for a moment, but it was enough. Judith turned to him, her eyes wide. "Richard, what's he talking about?" Franklin laughed, a sound too bright for the room. "Monsieur Poirot, you're grasping at straws. I said no such thing. Your nurse must have misheard her. Perhaps she's part of your little charade." Miss Cole gasped, shaking her head. "I heard you. I swear it. Enough." Judith snapped, standing again. "I'm tired of this. Richard, let's go. We don't need to sit here and be accused of nonsense." But Poirot's voice stopped her cold. "Mademoiselle Judith, if you leave with him now, you walk into danger. Dr. Franklin is not what he seems. He is a pawn, perhaps, but a pawn who moves at the will of another. Stay and let us uncover the truth together." Judith hesitated, her hand hovering near Franklin's. Hastings watched, his heart pounding, torn between his love for his daughter and his trust in Poirot. The room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for her choice. Finally, Judith's hand dropped to her side. "I'll stay," she said quietly, her voice trembling, "but only to prove you're wrong." Franklin's smile vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating look. "Very well," he said, rising. "If it's truth you want, Monsieur Poirot, let's have it. What's your game?" Poirot's eyes gleamed. "No game, Doctor, only justice. And tonight, justice will find its mark." As the guests dispersed after dinner, their murmurs echoing through the halls, Poirot and Hastings retired to the library. The fire had died to embers, casting a faint glow over the room. Hastings paced, his nerves frayed. That was a risky move, Poirot. Accusing Franklin like that would, if he's not involved. "Judith will never forgive me." Poirot's expression softened, a rare glimpse of vulnerability in his eyes. "Mon ami, I do not accuse lightly. But consider this. If Dr. Franklin is not X, he is still a man who courts danger. His words, his actions, they align too closely with the pattern of our manipulator. And your daughter. She is in his thrall." Hastings stopped pacing, his shoulders slumping. "What do we do now? If Franklin's a pawn, who's pulling the strings?" Poirot's fingers traced the edge of his blanket, his voice low. "That, Hastings, is the moral dilemma I face. To stop X, I must act decisively, perhaps ruthlessly. Justice demands a price, and I fear it may be one I am loath to pay." Hastings frowned, unease creeping into his chest. "What do you mean, Poirot? You're not planning something drastic, are you?" Poirot's gaze met his, steady and unyielding. "I am Hercule Poirot. My methods are precise, my conscience clear, but to protect the innocent, to protect your Judith, I may need to cross a line I have never crossed before. And you, mon ennemi, must trust me, even if you do not understand." The weight of Poirot's words settled over Hastings like a fog. The fire crackled, a single ember flaring briefly before fading to ash. Outside, the wind howled, and somewhere in the manor, a door creaked shut, as if sealing the fate of the night to come. The next morning, the household awoke to a grim discovery, a vial of rare toxin, identical to the one used in the tea party. Poisoning was found in Dr. Franklin's room, hidden beneath a loose floorboard. Judith, pale and shaken, confronted him in the drawing room, her voice breaking as she demanded answers. Franklin's denials were fervent, but his charm had lost its luster, and the other guests turned on him, their accusations sharp and unrelenting. Poirot, watching from his wheelchair, said nothing, but his eyes burned with a quiet intensity. The stage quarrel had done its work, exposing Franklin's duplicity and sowing doubt among the guests. But as Hastings watched his daughter's heart break, he couldn't shake the feeling that Poirot's plan had come at a cost. The moral dilemma loomed larger than ever. To unmask X, Poirot had manipulated the truth, bending others to his will as surely as X had done. And Hastings wondered, with a chill, whether his friend's pursuit of justice would leave them all unscathed. The chapter closed with Judith retreating to her room, tears in her eyes, and Poirot whispering to Hastings, "The truth hurts, mon ami, but it also protects. We are close, now very close, to the end." Chapter 10. The Final Showdown. The air in the drawing room at Styles Court hung heavy with anticipation, the kind that prickles the skin and sharpens the senses. The fire in the hearth crackled, casting flickering shadows across the faded wallpaper, its once vibrant patterns now dulled by decades of neglect. The guests, a motley assembly of suspects, sat in a tense semicircle, their faces a gallery of some pale, some defiant, others cloaked in feigned indifference. Hercule Poirot, diminutive and frail in his wheelchair, commanded the room's center, his presence a paradox of physical weakness and intellectual might. His eyes, sharp as ever, gleamed with the fire of a man who had unraveled the final thread of a deadly tapestry. Captain Arthur Hastings, seated closest to Poirot, felt his heart thud unevenly. The room's oppressive silence was broken only by the faint wheeze of Poirot's breathing and the occasional creak of a chair as a guest shifted uncomfortably. Hastings glanced at his old friend, noting the pallor of his skin, the slight tremble in his hands. Yet Poirot's gaze was unwavering, scanning each face with the precision of a jeweler inspecting a flawed gem. "Mes amis," Poirot began, his voice soft but resonant, cutting through the tension like a blade. "We gather tonight, not for pleasantries, but to unmask a truth most sinister. A murderer walks among us, not one who kills with their hands, but with the cunning of the mind. A puppeteer who pulls the strings of others' weaknesses, turning them into instruments of death." A murmur rippled through the room. Colonel Loutrell, his face ruddy from years of whiskey and war, scoffed audibly. "More of your theatrics, Poirot." "I've had enough of this nonsense." Poirot's lips curved into a faint, knowing smile. "Patience, Colonel. The truth, like a fine wine, requires time to breathe. Tonight, it shall breathe its last." Hastings shifted, his eyes darting to Judith, his daughter, who sat rigidly beside Dr. Franklin, the scientist whose charm masked a troubling darkness. Judith's face was a storm of emotions, defiance, fear, and something Hastings couldn't quite name. He wanted to reach for her, to pull her away from Franklin, but Poirot's earlier warning echoed in his mind. "Trust no one, Hastings. Not even those you love." Poirot raised a hand, silencing the room. "Let us begin with the facts. At Styles, we have witnessed a series of events, illnesses, near fatal falls, and, most tragically, a poisoning. Each was dismissed as misfortune, but I, Hercule Poirot, do not believe in coincidence. These were the work of one mind, one who orchestrates chaos while remaining unseen. This mind I call X." The nurse, Miss Cole, gasped softly, her hands twisting in her lap. The scholar, Mr. Boyd, adjusted his glasses, his expression unreadable. Stephen Norton, a quiet, unassuming man with a perpetually anxious demeanor, stared at the floor, his fingers tapping nervously against his knee. Poirot continued, his voice steady. "X is no ordinary killer. T does not wield a knife or a pistol. No, his weapon is the human soul, its fears, its desires, its frailties. He whispers, he manipulates, he plants the seed of murder in others' hearts. And they, poor fools, act upon it, believing themselves the architects of their deeds." Hastings felt a chill. He remembered the diary Poirot had found, its pages filled with cryptic notes detailing how X had orchestrated crimes in the past, pushing a jealous husband to strangle his wife, goading a desperate heir to poison his rival. The words had been chilling, written in a hand that seemed to mock the very idea of morality. Let us consider the events at Styles, Poirot said, his eyes narrowing. The maid's fear of an unseen watcher. Colonel's sudden illness after dinner. The balcony railing that gave way. The poisoned tea at the party. Each incident, carefully staged, designed to sow discord and suspicion. But why? To what end? Judith spoke up, her voice sharp. You saying someone here planned all this? Oh, it's absurd, Mr. Poirot. People get sick. Accidents happen. Poirot's gaze softened as he looked at her, but there was still beneath it. Mademoiselle Judith, you are young, and the young often see only the surface, but I see deeper. I see the hand that stirs the pot, the voice that whispers in the dark, and I know its name. A collective intake of breath filled the room. Hastings' pulse quickened. He leaned forward, his eyes locked on Poirot. Who is it, Poirot? Tell us. Poirot's fingers tightened around the arms of his wheelchair. First, let us examine the clues. The letter, torn and discarded in the library, spoke of betrayal and an inheritance. The diary, hidden in a false drawer, revealed a mind obsessed with control. The tampered boat, the misplaced watch at the scene of the staged suicide, these are not random. They point to one person, one who has been here all along, hiding behind a mask of meekness. All eyes turned to Stephen Norton. The man flinched, his face paling. Me? This is preposterous. I'm no murderer. Poirot raised a hand, silencing him. Sir Norton, you have played your part well, but the little gray cells, they do not lie. Let us walk through your crimes, step by step. The room seemed to shrink, the walls closing in as Poirot began his dissection. You arrived at Styles with no apparent motive, a guest invited by chance, or so it seemed. But I discovered your connection to a case from years past, a case where a man was driven to kill his brother over a disputed will. The brother's confession mentioned a friend who had encouraged his rage, fed his paranoia. That friend, Monsieur Norton, was you. Norton laughed, a brittle, nervous sound. You're mad, Poirot. I'm a nobody. I don't have the cunning for this. Cunning, Poirot said, is not always loud. Settle. Patient. You spoke to the colonel. Did you not? You remarked on his temper, suggested the nurse was mocking him behind his back. His illness followed a small dose of ipecac in his whiskey, enough to make him sick, but not to kill. You wanted him humiliated, weakened. The colonel's face darkened. You little weasel, he growled, half rising from his chair. Miss Cole grabbed his arm, pulling him back. Poirot continued, undeterred. The balcony incident. You loosened the railing, knowing the scholar, Mr. Boyd, often leaned there to smoke. A fall would be blamed on faulty carpentry, but you ensured he was there at the right moment, with a casual suggestion to enjoy the view. Boyd's mouth fell open. You're saying he tried to kill me? Not kill, Poirot corrected. Control. To make you fear. To make you suspect others. And the tea party out. What a masterpiece. The poison, a rare alkaloid, was placed in only one cup, meant for Miss Cole, but you miscalculated. The governess took it by mistake, and only my intervention saved her. Miss Cole's hands flew to her mouth. Why me? What did I do? You knew too much, Poirot said. You overheard Norton speaking to Dr. Franklin, discussing an experiment that chilled you. You did not understand it, but you were a threat, and so he acted. Franklin shifted uncomfortably, his charm faltering. Judith glared at him, her hands clenched. Hastings wanted to stand, to pull her away, but Poirot's voice held him in place. The diary, Poirot said, was your greatest mistake. Norton, you wrote of your triumphs cases where you turned friend against friend, lover against lover. You saw yourself as a god, shaping destinies. God, but you grew careless. The watch, left at the scene of the staged suicide, was yours. I found it, and I knew. Norton's face twisted, a flicker of something dangerous passing through his eyes. You have no proof, Poirot. These are stories, nothing more. Poirot's smile was cold. Proof. I have the diary, the letter, the watch. I have the testimony of the maid who saw you lurking near the balcony the night it was tampered with. I have the governess who heard you whisper to Franklin about the tea. And I have my own observations, your nervous tics, you're too perfect. Humility. U.R.X. Stephen Norton, the puppeteer. The room erupted. Colonel Luttrell shouted, Miss Cole sobbed, and Judith stood, her face pale. This can't be true, she whispered. Norton rose, his hands shaking. You're wrong, Poirot. You're dying, old man, and you're desperate to go out with a bang. This is your fantasy, not reality. Poirot's eyes never left Norton's. Then explain the poison in your pocket, monsieur. The vial you carry, the same alkaloid used in the tea. I saw you slip it there this morning, when you thought no one was watching. Norton's hand instinctively went to his coat pocket, then froze. The room fell silent, every eye on him. Slowly, he pulled out a small glass vial, its contents glinting in the firelight. His face crumpled, the mask of meekness falling away to reveal something raw, ugly. You think you've won? Norton spat, his voice rising. You think you can stop me? I've been playing this game longer than you know, Poirot. Shaped lives, ended them, all without a drop of blood on my hands. Kay, and you, in your wheelchair, think you can judge me. Poirot's voice was calm, almost gentle. I do not judge, monsieur, I reveal. And tonight, your game ends. Norton laughed, a wild, unhinged sound. He raised the vial, his eyes blazing. I go down. I take you all with me. In a swift motion, he uncorked the vial and tilted it toward his lips. Hastings lunged forward. But Poirot's voice stopped him. Nan, Hastings, let him choose. Norton froze, the vial inches from his mouth. His eyes locked with Poirot's, and for a moment the room seemed to hold its breath. Then, with a choked cry, Norton dropped the vial, shattered on the floor, the liquid hissing as it met the wood. He staggered, clutching his chest, his face contorting in pain. Hastings rushed to his side, but Norton collapsed, his body crumpling like a marionette with cut strings. Miss Cole screamed, and the colonel swore under his breath. Hastings knelt beside Norton, checking for a pulse, but there was none. He looked up at Poirot, his heart sinking. He's dead, Hastings said, his voice hollow. Poirot nodded, his face unreadable. The poison was his own. Hastings, I ensured it would be so. Hastings' head snapped up. You want? Poirot's eyes were heavy with sorrow. I knew he would try to escape justice, as he always has. So I replaced the vial's contents this morning with a toxin of my own choosing, one swift and merciful. He could not be allowed to continue. Hastings. Not after all he has done. The room was silent, the weight of Poirot's words settling over them like ash. Judith sank into her chair, tears streaming down her face. Franklin stood, his face pale, and slipped out of the room, unnoticed by all but Poirot, who made no move to stop him. Hastings stared at his friend, his mind reeling. You killed him, Poirot. You crossed the line. Poirot's voice was barely a whisper. Sometimes, mine and me, justice demands a price. I have paid it. He slumped slightly in his chair, his breath coming in shallow gasps. Hastings rushed to his side, fear gripping him. Poirot, what's wrong? Poirot's hand found Hastings, his grip weak but firm. My heart, Hastings. It has fought its last battle. But no, this eye have protected the innocent. Have stopped X and you. You must carry on. Hastings' eyes burned with tears. No, Poirot, don't leave me. Not now. Poirot's smile was faint, serene. The little gray cells, they have served their purpose. Now they rest. His eyes fluttered closed, and his hand went limp in Hastings. The room seemed to dim, the fire's warmth fading. Hastings knelt beside his friend, his sobs the only sound in the stunned silence. The guests sat frozen, their faces a mix of shock and grief. Judith approached, her hand trembling as she touched Hastings' shoulder. "Father, is he?" Hastings nodded, unable to speak. He looked at Poirot, his friend, his mentor, the man who had unraveled the impossible time and again. In that moment, he saw not the frail figure in the wheelchair, but the vibrant detective who had stood against evil with nothing but his mind and his unshakable sense of justice. As the guests dispersed, whispering among themselves, Hastings remained by Poirot's side. He thought of their first case at Styles, of the countless mysteries they had solved together. Poirot had always believed in order and the triumph of good over evil, and in his final act he had proven it, even at the cost of his own life. The night deepened, and Styles Court stood silent, its secrets laid bare. Hastings rose, his heart heavy but resolute. He would honor Poirot's legacy, not by mourning, by remembering the man who had taught him to see the world through the lens of truth. In the quiet of the drawing room, with only the dying embers for company, Hastings whispered, "Goodbye, my friend. You won." And somewhere, in the vast expanse of eternity, Hercule Poirot's little gray cells finally found peace.